I sat at a Thanksgiving table in a $2 million suburban mansion that I secretly paid for while my daughter-in-law complained about the dirt on my cheap work boots. She leaned into my son and whispered loudly enough for me to hear that it was time to dump me in a state-funded nursing home because I was completely useless to them. My son, the boy I broke my back to raise, simply took a sip of his wine and nodded in agreement. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I quietly folded my napkin and walked out the front door. By Friday morning, my $50 million secret was weaponized, and their perfect, arrogant life was over. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. The clinking of silver forks against pristine porcelain plates was the only sound in the massive vaulted dining room. I looked down at my hands resting on the edge of the mahogany table. They were dark, thick, and deeply scarred. The hands of a 73-year-old black man who had spent 40 years building a logistics and freight empire from a single rusted delivery truck back in the 1980s. Across from me sat my son Julian. His hands were manicured soft and currently wrapped around a crystal glass of $200 Cabernet. And next to him sat his wife, Chloe. My 38-year-old daughter-in-law was currently staring at my scuffed work boots with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Victor, Chloe sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose as if my very existence was giving her a migraine. I specifically asked everyone to take their shoes off in the foyer. I just paid $1,200 to have these Persian rugs deep cleaned. You are tracking dirt everywhere. I looked at her, my face completely blank. It is just dust, Chloe, I said, my voice low and calm. The same dust that paid for Julian's Ivy League tuition. Julian stiffened. His eyes darted to his plate. At 42, he was a mid-level bank executive who loved playing the role of a Wall Street titan. But underneath the bespoke suits and the forced corporate laugh, he was a coward. He hated when I brought up the past. He hated being reminded that his glamorous life was built on the sweat of a man who did not fit into his upscale country club aesthetic. That is ancient history, Dad, Julian mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. Chloe just likes the house kept a certain way. You have to respect that. I did not argue. Arguing is for people who need to prove something, and I had nothing left to prove. 5 years ago, after my beautiful wife Loretta passed away, I sold my entire regional warehouse network to a massive conglomerate. The deal was quiet, wrapped up in strict non-disclosure agreements and offshore holding companies. I walked away with $50 million in liquid assets and municipal bonds. I never told Julian. Why? Because I knew my son. I knew his desperate need to show off to his peers. I knew that despite all the advantages I gave him, he had grown into a man who valued labels over loyalty. And more importantly, I knew Chloe. She was a woman from a middle-class background who married him for a lifestyle he could not actually afford on his own. She ran a high-end fashion boutique downtown that bled money every single month, treating it like a glorified personal closet rather than a functioning business. For the last 3 years, I had been the invisible safety net, keeping their fragile house of cards from collapsing. Through a blind trust managed by my lawyers, I secretly subsidized Julian's massive monthly mortgage, pretending it was an executive retention bonus negotiated by his bank. I anonymously guaranteed the expensive commercial lease for Chloe's failing boutique. I even paid the leases on their matching luxury European cars through a corporate shell company. They thought they were self-made millionaires. They thought I was just a broke retired truck driver surviving on Social Security, living in my old 1980s brick house because I could not afford anything better. I let them believe it. I wanted to see who they truly were when they thought I had absolutely nothing left to give them. Tonight, I finally got my answer. Chloe pushed her plate away, annoyed that the catering service she hired had slightly overcooked the turkey. She leaned in toward Julian. She did not even bother to lower her voice to a whisper. She wanted me to hear it. She wanted to establish her dominance in her territory to show me exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of her perfect life. "I cannot do this anymore, Julian," she hissed, her blue eyes glaring at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered into her pristine dining room. "He smells like a garage. He is embarrassing in front of our friends. He is utterly useless to us now. Cut him off." We need to look into a state-funded nursing home and just be done with it. I am not spending my prime years taking care of a senile old man who contributes nothing to this household." The silence that followed her words was absolute heavy enough to crush bone. I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the alleyways of our old neighborhood, the boy I had worked 18-hour shifts for unloading freight in the freezing rain just so he would never have to know the feeling of going to bed with an empty stomach. Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. He looked at Chloe, then glanced at me, his face completely devoid of any defense, loyalty, or love. "We will look into some brochures on Monday," Julian muttered softly. "You are right. It is getting to be too much." He nodded. He actually nodded. My own flesh and blood had just agreed to throw me into a state facility to appease a woman who viewed me as garbage. He was willing to discard the man who gave him life simply because I did not match the aesthetic of his expensive dining room. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. Anger is an undisciplined emotion, and I had not built an empire by losing my discipline. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my mind. The illusion of my family had just died right there over a roasted turkey and expensive wine. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a perfect square, and placed it next to my plate. I stood up slowly. At the end of the long table, my 8-year-old grandson, Leo, looked up from his tablet. He had my late wife's bright eyes. He was the only pure thing left in this entire room. "Grandpa Vic, are you leaving?" Leo asked, his small voice breaking the heavy, suffocating tension. I walked over to him, placing my large, calloused hand gently on his head, ruffling his hair. "I have to go, little man. Grandpa has some work to do. You be good, okay?" "Okay, Grandpa," he smiled innocently, completely unaware of the poison sitting just a few feet away. I did not look at Julian. I did not acknowledge Chloe. I simply turned around and walked out the heavy front doors. "Oh, let him go," I heard Chloe scoff from the dining room as the door swung shut behind me. "He will be calling tomorrow, begging for grocery money. They always do." I walked down their perfectly manicured driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my heavy boots. I climbed into my rusted 2004 Ford truck. I turned the key and the engine roared to life with a loud blue-collar rumble that I knew made Chloe cringe behind her expensive window curtains. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the mansion I secretly owned, leaving them to their false sense of superiority. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, bitter chill in the air. I sat at the scratched wooden table in my old brick house, drinking my coffee black just the way I had for 50 years. The house was quiet, filled only with memories of Loretta and the ticking of the wall clock. I reached into the chest pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out my cheap flip phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Sterling Pierce. How can I help you, Victor?" Sterling was the senior partner at the most ruthless financial law firm in the state. He was the architect of the blind trust and the only man who knew the full extent of my wealth. "Sterling," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "It is time. Pull the plug." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Sterling knew exactly what I meant. He had warned me for years that subsidizing Julian's life was a mistake, that I was feeding a bottomless pit of entitlement. "All of it," Victor Sterling asked, verifying the order. "All of it," I confirmed. "Stop the mortgage subsidies immediately. Cancel the corporate leases on both of their luxury vehicles. Terminate the financial guarantee on Chloe's boutique lease. And freeze the emergency credit lines." "Understood?" Sterling replied, the sound of keyboard clacking already audible in the background. "The funds will be completely withdrawn by the end of the business day. The auto dealership will be notified of the lease defaults by tonight. They will be entirely on their own." "Good," I said. "Let them see how far arrogance gets them when the bank accounts run dry." I hung up the phone and took another sip of my coffee. The financial umbrella that had shielded them from the harsh reality of their own incompetence was officially gone. The storm was coming, and they did not even own a raincoat. Monday morning arrived with a quiet kind of peace that I had not felt in years. I sat at my small kitchen table. The wood was scratched and worn smooth from decades of use. My coffee was black and bitter. I liked it that way. It grounded me. It reminded me of the early days on the loading docks, before the millions, before the corporate lawyers, before the ultimate betrayal. The house was completely silent, except for the aggressive rhythmic buzzing of my cheap plastic flip phone vibrating against the Formica tabletop. I watched the small, unlit screen. It showed 87 missed calls, 87 desperate attempts to reach me between Friday night and Monday morning. Most were from Julian. A good number were from Chloe. I did not need to open them to know what was happening. The financial guillotine I had ordered my wealth manager to drop on Friday afternoon had finally sliced through their delicate web of lies. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The heat warmed my chest. I let the phone buzz. It stopped for a brief second, the screen going dark. Then immediately it lit up again. Call number 88. I reached out with my heavy calloused hand and flipped the phone open. I did not say hello. I simply pressed the device to my ear and listened to the chaos unfolding on the other end of the line. Dad Julian gasped. His voice was high-pitched, tight, and completely stripped of the corporate arrogance he usually wore like an expensive suit. "Dad, are you there? Pick up the phone. I need you to tell me what is going on right now." "I am here, Julian," I replied, my voice a flat, unbothered bass line against his rising panic. Thank God he breathed heavily, the sound of his hyperventilation echoing through the small speaker. "Dad, there is a massive mistake. Something is wrong with the accounts. The bank must have made some kind of catastrophic error. I am at the Oak Ridge Country Club right now. I just finished playing 18 holes with the senior partners from my firm. We had breakfast. We ordered a round of vintage scotch. I handed the waiter my American Express black card to cover the table, and he came back and told me it was declined. Declined, Dad. In front of the senior partners. I could hear the absolute terror in his voice. For a man like Julian, perception was reality. He lived and breathed for the approval of men who wore Rolex watches and drove imported sports cars. The Oak Ridge Country Club was his personal stage, a place where he played the role of a highly successful financial executive. He threw around that heavy metal credit card like it was a magic wand, paying for expensive dinners and imported cigars to prove he belonged in their exclusive inner circle. What Julian never told his wealthy golf buddies, and what he actively tried to forget himself, was that his impressive bank salary barely covered the minimum payments on his suffocating mountain of personal debt. The American Express black card he flashed around with so much pride was tied directly to a shadow account managed by my legal team. Every month for the past 3 years, my money had quietly flowed into that account to automatically wipe out his exorbitant balances. I paid for the vintage scotch. I paid for the country club membership. I paid for the illusion of his success. "Dad, you have to call, Sterling." Julian pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper as if he was trying to hide behind a pillar in the club lobby. "You have to call your lawyer right now and fix this. The waiter is standing right here waiting. My boss is looking at me like I'm a common criminal. I tried to use my other cards, but they are all frozen. The bank application on my phone says my accounts are locked due to insufficient funds and the sudden withdrawal of guarantor backing. What did Sterling do? Fix this before I lose my job." I listened to him hyperventilate. I listened to the boy I had raised beg for me to save him from a humiliation of his own making. Decades ago, I worked 18-hour shifts, hauling freight in the freezing rain so he could go to private schools and never know the sting of poverty. I built an empire from the dirt up, hoping to mold a man of character. Instead, my wealth had shielded him from reality, turning him into a weak, entitled coward who let his wife disrespect his own father. A year ago, I would have felt a pang of pity. I would have made the call, transferred the funds, and protected him from the consequences of his financial recklessness. But a year ago, I did not know that he was willing to throw me into a state-run facility just to keep his wife from throwing a tantrum over some dust on a rug. I lifted my mug and took a long, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The silence on the line stretched out heavy and absolute. Dad Julian begged, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his public embarrassment. "Did you hear me? You need to pay this bill right now. It is $15,000. I do not have that kind of liquid cash available. Please." I lowered my mug. The ceramic clicked softly against the wooden table. "I am useless." "Remember, Julian," I said. The line went dead silent. The panic in his breathing hitched and stopped entirely. He knew exactly what I was quoting. The memory of the Thanksgiving dinner table crashed down on him. "Dad, He started to stammer, fumbling for an excuse that did not exist, but I cut him off. Chloe said I was completely useless to you both. I continued, keeping my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. And you nodded, Julian. You looked me in the eye, and you agreed that your father was a burden meant to be discarded. Well, you cannot have it both ways. Useless old men who belong in state-funded nursing homes do not have the capacity to pay $15,000 credit card bills at luxury country clubs. Dad, please, you do not understand. Chloe was just stressed out about the holiday. We did not mean it. You cannot do this to me here, not in front of my boss. My entire career is based on my financial reputation. I am not doing anything to you, Julian, I replied coldly. I am simply giving you exactly what you asked for. You wanted me out of your financial life. You wanted to be done with me. Consider it done. You are a wealthy executive. Figure it out. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button. I snapped the flip phone shut, instantly severing his frantic pleading. I placed the phone back down on the kitchen table and took another peaceful sip of my coffee. The drink tasted better than it had in years. Less than 30 seconds passed. The plastic phone vibrated against the table again. It buzzed violently, moving slightly across the formica surface. I looked at the small screen. It was not Julian calling this time. It was Chloe. I did not answer. I let it ring. I watched the screen light up and go dark as the call went straight to my automated voicemail. A minute later, the phone beeped, indicating a new audio message had been recorded. I picked up the phone, dialed into my voicemail box, and put the device on speakerphone so her voice could fill my empty kitchen. Chloe was not crying. She was not begging like her weak-willed husband. She was absolutely unhinged with rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" she screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and echoing with pure malice. "You vindictive, pathetic old man. Julian is having a full-blown panic attack in the parking lot of his club because of your little stunt. You think you can just cut us off. You think you have any power over us. You live on Social Security. You drive a garbage truck and wear clothes from a discount bin. We are the ones who matter. We are the ones who take care of you." I listened to her rant, my face devoid of any emotion. She had absolutely no idea about the $50 million. She still believed I was a broke pensioner throwing a petty tantrum. She still believed she held all the cards because her mind was too clouded by arrogance to see the trap closing around her. "You listen to me, you senile old fool!" Chloe continued, her voice dropping into a vicious, threatening growl. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. If you do not call the bank and fix whatever administrative error you caused with Julian's accounts, we are done playing nice. We have the medical power of attorney. We have the legal right to manage your life and your assets. We are coming over there right now to kick you out of that disgusting brick house. Pack a bag, Victor, because by tonight you are going to be sitting in the cheapest ward of the worst facility I can find. You are nothing." The message ended with a loud, aggressive click. I slowly erased the voicemail. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidation. I felt a profound sense of anticipation. Chloe thought she was coming over to evict a helpless old man. She thought she was going to flex the legal muscle of a document she forced me to sign 5 years ago when I was recovering from heart surgery. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked over to my heavy oak desk in the corner of the living room. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a crisp, freshly notarized legal document that Sterling Pierce had hand-delivered to me on Friday evening. I laid the document flat on the center of the coffee table, placing it right where they would see it when they inevitably kicked my front door open. I sat back down in my worn leather recliner, crossed my arms over my chest, and waited for the storm to arrive. They wanted a war. They had absolutely no idea who they had just provoked. The heavy afternoon sun was beating down on the cracked concrete of my driveway when I heard the screech of tires. I was sitting in my worn leather recliner, the same chair I had occupied for the last 20 years. The front door was open to let the breeze in, with only the thin mesh screen standing between my quiet living room and the outside world. I did not have to look out the window to know who had just arrived. The aggressive revving of Julian's luxury sedan gave him away instantly. He always drove like a man trying to outrun his own insecurities. Heavy footsteps stomped up the wooden stairs of my porch. A second later, the screen door was kicked open with such force that the metal frame slammed against the brick wall of the house. It bounced back with a loud ringing vibration. Julian walked in first, his face flushed and his expensive silk tie loosened around his neck. He was sweating heavily, breathing as if he had just run a marathon. but he was not the one leading the charge. Right behind him, pushing past his shoulder, was Chloe. She marched into my living room like a conquering general claiming a conquered territory. She wore a sharp designer pantsuit that cost more than the roof over my head, her heels clicking loudly and sharply against my hardwood floors. I did not stand up. I did not offer them a seat. I just watched them invade my sanctuary with the calm indifference of a man who held all the cards. "Look at this place," Chloe sneered, waving her manicured hand in the air as if the very oxygen in my house offended her. "It smells like old paper and decay. You are living like a stubborn old fool, Victor. But that ends today. We are done playing your pathetic little games." She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a glossy, cheaply printed brochure. She threw it violently onto the solid oak coffee table in front of me. The pamphlet slid across the wood and stopped right next to my coffee mug. The cover featured a stock photo of a smiling nurse standing next to a frail old man in a wheelchair. The bold letters across the top read, "Shady Pines Assisted Living Facility, a place for your loved ones to rest." I glanced at the brochure, then looked up at Chloe. My expression remained entirely blank. "You have 2 hours to pack whatever fits into a single suitcase," Chloe demanded, pointing a sharp, perfectly painted fingernail at my chest. "Julian has already called the facility. They have a basic room available on the ground floor. It is nothing fancy, but it is exactly what you deserve. You are going to get in the car, and we are going to drop you off." I slowly shifted my gaze to Julian. He was standing slightly behind his wife, looking everywhere except at my face. He stared at the floorboards. He stared at the bookshelf. He was a 42-year-old executive who commanded boardrooms, but in this house, standing next to his vicious wife, he was nothing more than a terrified little boy. "Is that right, Julian?" I asked. My voice was a deep, quiet rumble in the tense room. "You drove all the way down here to throw your father into a state-funded warehouse." Julian finally forced himself to look at me. He swallowed hard. His face was pale, driven by the sheer panic of his frozen bank accounts and his shattered public image. "You left us no choice, Dad," Julian said, his voice trembling as he tried to sound authoritative. "You completely sabotaged my finances this morning. You humiliated me at the club. You shut down our accounts. I do not know how you managed to mess with the banking system, but we need cash immediately. The debt collectors are already calling. We are completely out of time." "And how exactly does putting me in a home solve your financial incompetence?" I asked, leaning back into my leather recliner. Chloe stepped forward, blocking my view of Julian. She slammed a thick, stapled legal document down on the coffee table right next to the nursing home brochure. The paper hit the wood with a heavy, definitive thud. "This solves it, you arrogant old man!" Chloe spat a vicious, triumphant grin spreading across her face. I recognized the document immediately. It was a medical and financial power of attorney. 5 years ago, I had to undergo a severe open-heart surgery. It was a risky procedure. At the time, I still believed my son loved me. I believed he had my best interests at heart. I signed that document, giving Julian full legal authority to make medical decisions for me if I fell into a coma and temporary control over my assets to pay my hospital bills if I could not do it myself. I survived the surgery, but Julian never gave the document back. I knew he kept a copy hidden in his home safe. I just never expected him to use it as a weapon against me. "Julian controls your assets now," Chloe declared, crossing her arms over her chest with absolute arrogance. "That piece of paper gives my husband complete legal authority over your life, your medical care, and your property. You are a sick, failing old man who can no longer make rational decisions. We are taking over." Julian took a step forward, finally finding a scrap of false courage. "We are selling this house, Dad," he said, trying to sound like he was doing me a favor. "The real estate market is incredibly hot right now. We can easily get $400,000 for this lot. That money will clear the credit card debt you refused to pay this morning. It will cover the arrears on the luxury cars. Whatever is left over will go toward your basic care at the facility. It is the only logical solution. You are going to sell my house, the house where your mother raised you to pay for your European cars and your country club membership," I stated simply, clarifying the sheer depravity of their plan. "We are taking what is rightfully ours." Chloe snapped, her patience completely gone. "You owe us for the embarrassment you caused this morning. Now stop wasting our time. Get up and go pack your bags. If you refuse to leave quietly, Julian will call the police, show them the power of attorney, and have you forcibly removed from the premises as a danger to yourself." They really thought they had won. They thought they had backed a helpless pensioner into an inescapable corner. They believed a piece of paper signed half a decade ago was the ultimate trump card. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply reached over to the small wooden end table next to my recliner. I opened the single sliding drawer. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, white sheet of paper. I held it in my hand for a moment, letting the silence stretch out, letting their smug confidence hang in the air for just a second longer. Then I tossed the paper onto the coffee table. It landed perfectly on top of their outdated power of attorney. "What is this?" Chloe sneered, glaring at the paper as if it were coated in poison. "Another one of your pathetic tricks. Read it, Julian," I commanded, keeping my eyes locked on my son. "Read it out loud." Julian hesitated. He looked at my calm expression, and a flicker of genuine dread crossed his face. He stepped forward with shaking hands and picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the bold legal heading at the top of the page. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. His jaw dropped slightly and his shoulders slumped as if the air had been violently sucked out of his lungs. The false courage he had walked in with evaporated instantly. "What does it say, Julian?" Chloe demanded, her voice sharp and impatient. "Tell him to pack his bags." Julian could barely speak. His voice was a hollow, breathless whisper. "It is a revocation of power of attorney." Chloe froze. "What?" Julian kept reading, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon, looking for a loophole that simply did not exist. "It is notarized, Chloe. It is officially stamped and filed by Sterling Pierce. It was executed last Friday. He legally revoked my authority. I have absolutely zero power over him." Chloe snatched the paper out of his hands, her eyes scanning the ink with frantic desperation. "This cannot be real," she shrieked. "You cannot just cancel it. We had a legal agreement." "A power of attorney is a privilege, Chloe," I said quietly, interlacing my fingers and resting them on my lap. "It is a privilege granted by a sane, capable adult. And as a sane, capable adult, I have the absolute right to revoke that privilege at any time. I filed that paperwork 3 days ago. Julian has no right to my medical decisions. He has no right to my finances, and he certainly has no right to sell the house I built with my own 2 hands. The realization crashed down on them like a concrete block. Their master plan, their saving grace, the golden ticket that was supposed to wipe out their crushing debt, had just been burned to ash in front of their eyes. "You have no legal authority in this house," I continued, my voice carrying the heavy, unbreakable weight of absolute truth. "You are standing in my living room, uninvited, threatening an eviction you cannot enforce. Your piece of paper is nothing but garbage. You own nothing, you control nothing, you are nothing." Julian stumbled backward, dropping the outdated brochure onto the floor. He looked around the room as if he had just realized he was trapped in a burning building with no exits. "Dad, please," he stammered. "The cars. They are going to take the cars. They are going to ruin my credit score. You have to help us." "I will not lift a single finger," I replied coldly. Chloe's face turned a violent, dark shade of red. The panic and humiliation quickly twisted into pure, unhinged rage. She crumpled the revocation document in her fist and threw it at my feet. Her chest heaved as she breathed heavily, glaring at me with the feral hatred of a cornered animal. "You think you are so smart," she screamed, her voice echoing painfully against the brick walls of my home. "You think this little piece of paper protects you. You are just a senile, bitter old man making terrible decisions. We do not need your permission to take over." She grabbed Julian by the arm and yanked him toward the door. "Fine," she spat, turning back to look at me with venomous eyes. "You want to play hardball? We will play hardball. We are going to court. We will hire a doctor to testify that you are completely out of your mind. We will prove you are senile, delusional, and incapable of managing yourself. The judge will strip you of your rights and hand everything to Julian anyway. We will take this house and we will take every single penny you have hidden away in your pathetic little bank accounts." She shoved the screen door open so hard it nearly ripped off its hinges. "You are going to rot in that facility, Victor," she screamed from the porch. They stormed down the stairs, their heavy footsteps fading as they rushed back to their luxury sedan. The car started with a loud roar, the tires squealing against the asphalt as they sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. I sat alone in my quiet living room. I looked at the crumpled piece of paper on the floor. I did not feel angry. I did not feel threatened. Chloe had just promised to drag me into a courtroom to prove I was insane. She wanted a legal war to seize my bank accounts. I smiled slowly, a cold, calculated smile. She wanted to open my financial records in front of a judge. She was absolutely desperate to dig into my accounts. I reached for my coffee mug and took another sip. If she wanted to go to court and uncover my secrets, I was going to let her. It was time to show them exactly what $50 million of invisible power looked like. I did not sleep much that Tuesday night. I did not need to. When you spend 40 years managing logistics and freight schedules across 3 different time zones, you learn how to calculate exact arrival times. You learn how to coordinate moving parts so perfectly that the impact is absolutely unavoidable. You learn that patience is a weapon. I knew exactly what time the heavy-duty tow trucks would pull into Julian's perfectly manicured subdivision. I had approved the repossession order myself. You see, arrogant people never read the fine print. They are too distracted by the shine of the metal and the smell of the leather to ask the important questions. They assume the world naturally bends to their desires. When Julian brought home his shiny black Porsche 911, and when Chloe parked her pristine white Mercedes luxury sport utility vehicle in the driveway, they paraded them around like trophies. They posted pictures on their social media pages to farm validation from strangers. They boasted to their country club friends about their incredible success and their high-level corporate status. But neither of those luxury vehicles belonged to them. They never did. They belonged to a corporate shell company called Vanguard Logistics. I built Vanguard Logistics with my own 2 hands. The vehicles were registered strictly as corporate fleet cars leased exclusively for executive use. I simply paid the massive monthly installments out of a blind trust, letting my son pretend he was the mastermind behind his own wealth. But the moment I ordered Sterling Pierce to cut the financial cord on Friday afternoon, those leases fell into immediate default. And corporate asset recovery does not wait for a convenient time. Corporate asset recovery is cold calculated and ruthlessly efficient. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, the quiet, exclusive stillness of Maplewood Estates was violently shattered. I sat in my worn leather recliner, nursing a glass of warm water, watching the live global positioning tracking data on my digital tablet. 2 heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks, fully illuminated with rotating yellow strobe lights, backed slowly into Julian's expansive concrete driveway. The amber lights flashed, aggressively reflecting off the expensive brick facades of the neighboring mansions, casting a chaotic, alarming glow through the darkness. The loud hydraulic hiss of the tow truck beds lowering echoed through the silent suburban street like a gunshot. The operators were professionals. They moved with absolute efficiency, their faces grim and determined. Heavy steel chains clanked sharply against the pavement, the sound slicing through the quiet neighborhood. The thick metal hooks secured the axles of the Porsche and the Mercedes with ruthless precision. The loud mechanical grinding of the winches pulling the heavy vehicles up the steep metal ramps was enough to wake the dead. And it certainly woke my son. It woke him from the delusion he had been sleeping in for the past 3 years. Through the security feed tied to the corporate fleet accounts and through the frantic voicemails that would soon flood my phone, I knew the exact sequence of events. The heavy oak front door of the mansion swung open with tremendous force. Julian sprinted out onto the porch completely barefoot, wearing his expensive silk pajamas. He was frantic. He waved his arms wildly in the cold night air, sprinting down the driveway and screaming at the tow truck operators at the top of his lungs. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "Put that car down right now. You are stealing my vehicles. Stop the winches. I will call the police. I will have you arrested for grand theft." The lead operator, a massive man wearing a high-visibility reflective vest, did not flinch. He had dealt with angry, bankrupt men 1,000 times before. He calmly reached into the front pocket of his heavy jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded paperwork. He shined a bright tactical flashlight directly into Julian's face, temporarily blinding him, and shoved the legal documents against his chest. "I suggest you read the paperwork before you dial 911, sir." The operator said, his voice flat, bored, and completely unbothered. "We are not stealing anything. We are executing a legal corporate asset recovery on behalf of Vanguard Logistics. These vehicles are in severe financial default." Julian grabbed the papers, his hands shaking violently in the yellow light. He squinted against the harsh strobe flashes, frantically scanning the legal jargon. He looked for his name. He looked for his signature. He found nothing. The vehicles were never registered in his name. The expensive auto insurance was not in his name. The titles belonged entirely to a holding company that he had absolutely no legal connection to. The phantom corporate bonus he thought he had negotiated years ago was a complete fabrication. He was nothing but an unauthorized driver of a company car. "This is a massive mistake," Julian stammered, his confident executive persona completely evaporating into the cold night air. "You do not understand who I am. I am a senior bank executive. I can pay whatever the outstanding balance is. Just unhook the cars right now. I will give you a premium credit card to clear the debt." The operator let out a short, dismissive laugh that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Your credit cards are declined, buddy. That is exactly why we are here. Now step back from the mechanical equipment before you get hurt." By this time, the loud commotion had woken up the entire street. Exterior porch lights flicked on one by one up and down the wealthy block. The neighbors, the doctors, the corporate lawyers, the investment directors that Julian and Chloe spent so much agonizing energy trying to impress were stepping out onto their balconies and peering through their custom window blinds. Chloe emerged from the front door, clutching a silk robe tightly around her body. She stood frozen on the porch, her face pale with absolute horror. She was watching her entire social status being dragged up onto a metal ramp in front of everyone she cared about. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy lifestyle was being dismantled piece by piece under the glaring yellow strobe lights of a repossession truck. She could not scream, she could not fight, she could not order them away. She just stood there utterly humiliated as the tow truck secured. The vehicle shifted into gear and drove away into the dark night, leaving the massive concrete driveway completely empty. The next morning, reality set in, with a brutal, unforgiving weight. The sun rose over a house that suddenly felt like a massive, echoing tomb. Julian stood in his grand foyer, staring out the massive front window at the empty space where his European sports car used to sit. He was a senior bank executive who could not even drive himself to his own office. The shiny keys, sitting in the decorative glass bowl by the door, were now completely useless pieces of metal, mocking his failure. He was stripped of his armor. He was stripped of his identity. He had to open the rideshare application on his phone and order a car. He had to stand on his front curb in the broad daylight, holding his expensive Italian leather briefcase, actively avoiding the judgmental stares of his wealthy neighbors who were quietly pulling out of their own driveways in their own luxury cars. The neighborhood gossip was already spreading like wildfire. He felt a burning, suffocating shame when a battered 10-year-old economy sedan with a cracked bumper pulled up to his multi-million-dollar estate to give him a ride. He slid into the back seat, avoiding the driver's eyes, feeling smaller than he ever had in his entire life. But Julian was not going to the office. He could not face his colleagues after his credit card was declined the day before. He was far too desperate for that. He climbed into the back seat of the cheap car and ordered the driver to take him directly to the main commercial branch of his bank. He was sweating profusely in the back seat, his mind racing with frantic, terrifying calculations. He had maxed out every single credit card he owned. He had no vehicles to drive. He had aggressive debt collectors calling his private cell phone number every 15 minutes demanding payment. The walls were closing in fast. But in his mind, he still had one massive asset left to save him: the $2 million mansion. He thought he could fix everything. He thought he could walk into the senior bank manager's office, leverage the massive equity of his suburban estate, and take out a $500,000 second mortgage to wipe the slate clean. He believed he was still the master of his own financial destiny. He believed that real estate was his ultimate safety net. He had absolutely no idea that the massive house he slept in, the house he was about to try and borrow against, did not belong to him either. I sat in my old leather recliner, sipping my morning coffee, and waited for the next inevitable phone call. I knew the trap had already snapped shut. Julian was walking straight into a solid brick wall, and he was doing it at full speed. I knew exactly when Julian walked through the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank. My wealth manager, Sterling Pierce, had eyes everywhere in the financial district. Julian had demanded Chloe meet him there so they could sign the paperwork together. He wanted her to see him playing the role of the powerful provider. He wanted to wash away the humiliation of the tow trucks and the cheap rideshare car. He straightened his expensive silk tie and marched up to the mahogany desk of the senior branch manager. The branch manager was a man named Richard. Richard had played golf with Julian. Richard had drank expensive scotch with Julian. Julian assumed this social relationship meant he could bypass the usual strict banking protocols. He sat down in the plush leather chair across from Richard. Chloe sat next to him, crossing her legs and looking at her diamond ring. She was already mentally spending the money they did not have. She was planning to buy back her luxury vehicle and maybe book a trip to a tropical island to recover from the intense stress of the morning. Julian leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the mahogany desk. He put on his best authoritative executive voice. "Richard," he said, "I need to pull some equity out of my suburban estate. Just a small bridge loan to cover some unexpected administrative expenses. $500,000 should do it. Draw up the paperwork and I will sign it right now." Richard smiled, a polite corporate smile, and typed Julian's home address into his banking computer system. He expected to see a massive amount of equity tied to a high-earning executive. He clicked a few buttons to pull up the official county property deed. Richard stopped typing. His polite smile faded into a look of genuine confusion. He leaned closer to his computer monitor. He clicked another button to verify the information. Then he looked up at Julian. "Julian," Richard said slowly, "I am confused. Are you looking to secure a loan against a different property?" Julian frowned. "No," he replied confidently. "I am talking about my primary residence, the $2 million estate in Maplewood, the house Chloe and I have lived in for the past 10 years. Just pull the equity from that deed. We have plenty of value built up." Richard took off his reading glasses and set them carefully on his desk. "Julian, you cannot take out an equity loan on that property," Richard explained, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable register. "You do not own it." Chloe uncrossed her legs. She let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "What are you talking about, Richard?" she snapped impatiently. "Of course we own it. We have lived there since we got married. Julian pays the mortgage every single month without fail." Richard turned the computer monitor around so they could see the screen clearly. "I am sorry to tell you this," Richard said, pointing at the official legal documentation, "but you are not listed anywhere on this property deed. There is no mortgage in your name. This entire estate was purchased with a single cash transaction 10 years ago. It is owned outright and exclusively by a corporate entity called the Rollins Trust." Julian stared at the screen. The letters blurred together. The Rollins Trust. He knew that name. It was the blind trust I had set up before I retired. Julian felt the blood drain from his face completely. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized the absolute magnitude of his delusion. For a decade, he had been living in a $2 million mansion, believing he was the master of his domain. He thought the monthly payments he was making were building his personal wealth. He never bothered to check the actual deed because his ego would not allow him to question his own success. He never realized that the minimal housing payments he made were just heavily subsidized rent. I owned the walls around him. I owned the roof over his head. I owned the ground he walked on. They were nothing but glorified tenants, living entirely by my quiet grace. Julian, Richard asked quietly, looking at my son with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. "Did you honestly not know that you were renting your own home?" Julian could not speak. His throat was completely dry. He stood up from the leather chair. His knees shook beneath him. He felt the crushing weight of his absolute financial ruin bearing down on his shoulders. He did not have $500,000 in equity. He did not have a single dollar in equity. He was a 42-year-old man with a negative net worth and absolutely no assets to his name. Chloe did not understand at first. She looked at Julian, expecting him to correct the bank manager and demand their money. But Julian just turned around and walked out of the office in complete silence. He looked like a ghost. Chloe chased after him into the expansive marble lobby of the bank. "Julian," she demanded, grabbing his arm and pulling him to a stop. "What is going on? Tell Richard to fix the paperwork and give us our money." Julian looked at his wife with hollow, dead eyes. "We do not have a house, Chloe," he whispered in defeat. "My father owns it. He owns all of it. We have nothing." The reality finally pierced through Chloe's thick layer of arrogance. The sheer terror of her situation hit her all at once. She was standing in the middle of a high-end bank lobby, wearing designer clothes she could no longer afford. Her cars were gone. Her credit cards were completely useless. And now the multi-million-dollar mansion she loved to show off to her friends belonged to the very man she had tried to throw into a state-funded nursing home just a few days ago. Chloe began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved dramatically. She let out a loud, uncontrollable sob that echoed off the high marble ceilings. Dozens of wealthy clients and bank tellers turned to stare at her. She was having a massive public panic attack. She collapsed onto a leather bench in the waiting area, digging her manicured nails into her scalp. Her perfect blonde hair fell into her face in a messy tangle. She rocked back and forth, muttering frantically to herself. She had spent her entire adult life running away from poverty, and now poverty had caught up to her and dragged her back down into the dirt. Julian tried to calm her down, but she violently slapped his hand away. "Do not touch me," she screamed hysterically. "You are a failure. You promised me a wealthy life, and you gave me absolutely nothing." Julian stood there in the middle of the bank lobby, completely paralyzed by his own shame. He could not defend himself. He knew she was right. He had built his entire marriage on a foundation of my money. Now that the foundation was gone, his marriage was collapsing right in front of him. Chloe could not handle the humiliation of the stairs. She jumped up from the bench and sprinted out the heavy glass doors of the bank, leaving Julian behind. She ran down the busy sidewalk blindly, pushing past pedestrians until she found a quiet, dirty alleyway tucked between two corporate high-rises. She leaned against the cold brick wall, gasping for air. Her mind raced with dark, desperate thoughts. She was entirely broke. Her boutique was bleeding money every day. She had no assets to leverage. But she was a survivalist, and cornered animals are always the most dangerous. She pulled her expensive smartphone out of her purse. Her hands shook violently as she scrolled through her contacts. She passed by her wealthy friends. They would only mock her now. She passed by her family. They did not have the kind of money she needed to survive this crisis. She stopped when she found a specific name, Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans was a high society psychiatrist who catered strictly to the wealthy elite. He was also a man completely devoid of a moral compass. Chloe knew him from her country club social circles. She knew he had a dangerous reputation for providing specific medical diagnoses in exchange for heavy, under-the-table cash payments. He helped wealthy families secure strong prescription medications, and he helped impatient heirs gain early access to inheritances by declaring elderly relatives mentally unfit to manage their own estates. Chloe pressed the call button and pressed the phone to her ear. She chewed on her bottom lip, waiting nervously for him to answer. "Dr. Evans." Chloe said, her voice dropping to a frantic conspiratorial whisper. "It is Chloe. I need your help immediately. It is an absolute emergency." I listened to the clear audio recording of this exact phone call later that evening. Sterling had hired an elite private investigator the moment Julian left my brick house the day before. The investigator was standing less than 20 feet away, pretending to read a financial newspaper while holding a highly sensitive directional microphone pointed straight down the alleyway. "What kind of emergency?" Dr. Evans asked, his voice smooth and highly calculated. "It is about my father-in-law," Chloe whispered urgently. "He has completely lost his mind. He is 73 years old and he is experiencing severe paranoid delusions. He is actively destroying his own financial estate and deliberately harming our family. I need a medical conservatorship. I need you to declare him mentally incompetent so Julian can legally take over his trust fund." "A medical conservatorship is a very complex legal process," Chloe the doctor replied cautiously. "I would need to evaluate him extensively. I cannot just sign a piece of paper without solid medical proof of severe cognitive decline." "I will give you the proof," Chloe hissed, her voice dripping with pure, ruthless malice. "I will bring you to his house tomorrow. We will tell him it is a free wellness check. I just need you to prescribe something strong, something that will make him confused and disoriented during your evaluation. If you give him the right medication, he will look completely senile." The line was quiet for a long moment. The doctor was weighing the immense legal risk against his own insatiable greed. "That level of medical intervention will be incredibly expensive," Dr. Evans finally said. "I require a significant retainer for this kind of specialized private consultation." "I do not care what it costs." Chloe promised wildly, making reckless deals with money she did not have. "I will get you the cash by tomorrow afternoon. Just bring the medication, write the final report. We are going to lock that arrogant old man away and take every single thing he owns." She hung up the phone. She leaned back against the dirty brick wall and let out a long, shaky breath. She thought she had just solved all her massive financial problems. She thought she was a brilliant strategist manipulating the legal system to secure her wealthy lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea that she had just walked directly into a massive federal trap. She had fully crossed the line from a greedy daughter-in-law to a desperate criminal. I was going to let her dig her own grave as deep as she possibly could before I finally buried her in it. The heavy oak front door of my brick house resonated with 3 sharp knocks. I did not move immediately from my worn leather recliner. I glanced at the vintage grandfather clock against the far wall. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I knew who was standing on my porch. My wealth manager, Sterling Pierce, had called me an hour ago to warn me. He had intercepted a digital communication from Dr. Evans to a local probate attorney. The trap Chloe had desperately tried to set in that dirty alleyway yesterday was currently standing on my front welcome mat. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door. I took a moment to appreciate my living room. Just 24 hours ago, a team of highly specialized private security contractors hired by Sterling had spent the entire afternoon in this exact space. They did not touch the furniture. They did not disrupt the dust on the shelves. Instead, they meticulously installed 6 ultra-high-definition micro cameras. One was hidden inside the binding of an old encyclopedia. Another was wired directly into the smoke detector on the ceiling. A third was perfectly concealed behind the face of the wall clock. Each camera was equipped with directional microphones capable of picking up a whisper from 50 feet away. My simple brick house was now a maximum security surveillance vault. I opened the front door. Julian stood on the porch looking absolutely miserable. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation. Beside him stood Chloe, wearing a modest pastel dress that was completely out of character for her. She had clearly dressed down to look like a humble, concerned daughter-in-law. Standing slightly behind them was a tall, slender man carrying a black leather briefcase. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and a silver watch that caught the afternoon sun. "Hello, Victor," Chloe said. Her voice was dripping with a sickeningly sweet fake enthusiasm. "I hope we are not interrupting your afternoon nap. We brought a guest. This is Dr. Evans. He works with a county outreach program that provides free wellness checks for seniors living independently. We just want to make sure you are doing okay after all the stress from the holidays." I looked at Julian. He could not meet my gaze. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes. He knew this was a massive violation. He knew he was participating in a clinical fraud to steal my autonomy, but his cowardice kept him completely silent. I opened the screen door and stepped back. I did not invite them in with words, but I left the doorway clear. Chloe immediately walked inside, motioning for the doctor to follow her. Julian trailed behind them like a beaten dog. I began my performance. To beat a predator, you have to make them believe they have already won. I rounded my shoulders and let my posture droop. I shuffled my feet slightly against the hardwood floor, dragging the soles of my slippers to simulate frailty. I walked back to my leather recliner and sat down heavily, letting out a long, tired breath. I made my eyes look glassy and unfocused, staring blankly at the wall just slightly past Dr. Evans. The doctor took a seat on the floral sofa across from me. He unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad and a silver pen. He crossed his legs and leaned forward, placing a look of deep professional sympathy on his face. "It is very nice to meet you, Victor," Dr. Evans said. His voice was incredibly smooth and deliberately slow. He spoke to me as if I were a confused toddler. "Your son and daughter-in-law have expressed some deep concerns about your overall well-being lately. I am just here to ask you a few simple questions. Just a friendly chat between 2 men. Is that all right with you?" I nodded slowly. I let my mouth hang open just a fraction of an inch to sell the illusion of cognitive decline. Dr. Evans clicked his pen. "Victor, can you tell me what day of the week it is today?" I paused for a long time. I let the silence stretch out, making it completely uncomfortable for everyone in the room except me. I furrowed my brow, pretending to search for an answer in a foggy mind. "I think it is Tuesday," I mumbled softly. "Maybe Wednesday. The days blend together when you do not work anymore." Dr. Evans wrote something down on his legal pad. He nodded encouragingly. "That is perfectly normal, Victor. Do not worry about that. Can you tell me if you have been experiencing any unusual stress lately? Have you been feeling confused about your finances or your daily routines?" Before I could answer, Chloe jumped into the conversation. She could not help herself. Her greed made her impatient. "He has been incredibly confused," Dr. Chloe said, placing a comforting hand on Julian's shoulder. "Just a few days ago, he completely forgot that he does not own our luxury vehicles. He called a tow truck company and had our cars illegally repossessed in the middle of the night. He told the drivers he was a corporate executive. It was terrifying. We think he is experiencing severe paranoid delusions about wealth. Dr. Evans looked at Chloe with a perfectly practiced expression of medical concern. He turned his attention back to me. Victor, is this true? Do you believe you are a corporate executive? Do you feel like people are trying to take things from you? I stared blankly at the coffee table. I let my hands tremble slightly, resting on the arms of the recliner. They took the trucks, I whispered, keeping my voice fragile and distant. I built the company and they took the trucks away. The bank took the cars. I do not understand why the bank took the cars. Julian flinched. He knew I was referencing the actual reality of his financial ruin, but Dr. Evans completely misinterpreted the statement. Evans eagerly scribbled a long paragraph onto his legal pad. He saw a broken old man experiencing severe auditory and visual hallucinations. He saw exactly what Chloe had paid him to see. Does he wander out of the house often? Dr. Evans asked, directing the question entirely to Chloe as if I were completely invisible. All the time, Chloe lied smoothly. She was a natural-born manipulator. We have to come over here constantly to make sure he has not left the stove on. He forgets who Julian is sometimes. Just yesterday, he looked at Julian and told him he was no son of his. It broke my husband's heart. Julian swallowed hard, but remained completely silent. He was allowing his wife to construct a fictitious medical history that would legally strip away my human rights. He was crossing the ultimate point of no return. Dr. Evans nodded solemnly. He closed his leather portfolio and tucked his silver pen inside his jacket pocket. Well, Chloe Julian, I think I have seen enough for a preliminary evaluation. The cognitive decline appears to be rapidly accelerating. The delusions of grandeur combined with the memory loss are classic indicators of advanced neurodegenerative disease. We need to take immediate steps to ensure his safety and protect his estate from his own destructive actions. The sheer audacity of the medical professional was breathtaking. He had diagnosed me with late-stage dementia after asking me 2 questions and listening to the absolute lies of an angry daughter-in-law. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. They needed to complete their financial transaction. They needed privacy to exchange the bribe. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I placed my trembling hands on the armrests of my recliner. I let out a soft groan and pushed myself up with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I stood with a hunched back and looked toward the hallway. I need to use the restroom, I muttered, not looking at any of them directly. My joints hurt today. Take your time, Victor, Dr. Evans said sweetly. We will wait right here for you. I shuffled my feet slowly across the living room rug. I dragged my slippers against the floorboards, letting the sound of my slow departure echo through the room. I turned the corner into the narrow hallway and walked into the guest bathroom. I closed the solid wooden door behind me and locked it with a loud, distinct click. The moment the lock engaged, my hunched posture completely vanished. I stood up perfectly straight. I rolled my shoulders to release the tension of playing a frail victim. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I opened the secure surveillance application provided by Sterling Pierce. The screen illuminated instantly, showing a crystal-clear 4-resolution live video feed of my living room. The hidden microphones delivered perfect lossless audio directly into my earpiece. On the screen, I saw Julian burying his face in his hands. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Chloe, however, was moving with frantic electric energy. The moment she heard my bathroom door lock, she dropped the sweet, concerned daughter routine. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, ruthless ambition. She reached into her oversized designer handbag. She dug past her expensive makeup and her useless maxed-out credit cards. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The envelope was visibly bulging. I knew exactly what was inside. Chloe had spent the entire morning liquidating the last remaining inventory from her failed boutique at wholesale prices. She had emptied the last few dollars from Julian's emergency savings account. She had scraped together every single dollar of liquid cash she could find to fund this ultimate betrayal. Chloe stepped over to Dr. Evans. She shoved the thick envelope directly into the psychiatrist's waiting hands. Evans did not hesitate. He took the envelope and weighed it in his palm. A greasy, satisfied smile spread across his face. He ran his thumb over the unsealed flap, verifying the stacks of $100 bills waiting inside. He smoothly folded the envelope and slid it deep into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit. "Write the late-stage Alzheimer's report tonight," Chloe demanded. Her voice was sharp and vicious, completely devoid of any human empathy. Make it bulletproof. I want the language to clearly state he is an immediate danger to himself and others. I want it on my desk by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We file for emergency guardianship tomorrow at the courthouse. Once we get the judge to sign the conservatorship, I will pay you the remaining 50% of our agreed-upon total." Dr. Evans patted his suit pocket. "Do not worry, Chloe," the doctor whispered back, his voice dripping with professional corruption. "I will make sure the medical evaluation is entirely comprehensive. The court will not ask any questions. He will be legally incapacitated before the weekend. You will have full financial control." Julian finally looked up from his hands. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of guilt and terror, "are we really doing this? We are locking him away. What if they find out the evaluation is fake? What if Sterling fights us in court?" "Shut up, Julian," Chloe hissed, spinning around to glare at her husband. "You spineless coward. We are out of money. We have no cars and no future. This is the only way we survive. The old man is going into a home and we are taking the trust fund. It is done." I stared at my phone screen in the quiet solitude of my bathroom. I watched the clear, undeniable digital evidence of their federal crime being captured from 3 different camera angles. They had just conspired to commit medical fraud, bribery, and elder abuse in my own living room. They had freely admitted their plan to steal my estate. The audio was pristine. The video was perfect. The trap had just snapped shut around their necks with a violent, bone-crushing finality. I calmly flushed the toilet. I washed my hands in the sink, taking my time to dry them on a fresh towel. I unlocked the bathroom door and resumed my hunched, shuffling posture. I walked back into the living room, staring blankly at the wall, ready to play my part, until the moment I finally decided to destroy them. I knew exactly what Chloe was doing that Friday morning. My private investigator sent me a detailed encrypted message the moment she pulled her cheap compact rental car into the downtown commercial parking garage. It was a humiliating downgrade for a woman who based her entire self-worth on the hood ornament of her vehicle. Because her pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle had been violently repossessed by my corporate fleet managers just 2 nights ago, she was forced to drive a battered economy sedan. She gripped the plastic steering wheel with white knuckles, absolutely disgusted by the stained cloth seats and the faint smell of stale cigarette smoke that lingered in the cabin. She deliberately parked the pathetic little car several blocks away from the high-end plaza. She could not bear the thought of her affluent customers seeing her step out of such a low-class automobile. She was exhausted, fueled only by the frantic, manic energy of her impending crime. She had just paid the corrupt psychiatrist. She believed the fake medical report was currently being drafted. She honestly thought she was only 24 hours away from seizing my entire estate and locking me away in a bleak state-funded nursing home. But delusions of grandeur can only protect a person for so long. She needed to maintain her public image. She needed to be seen at her luxury fashion boutique downtown. She needed to project the absolute illusion of success to her wealthy country club friends and her elite clients. She needed the validation of the other high society wives who spent their husbands' money on overpriced garments they would only wear once. The downtown commercial plaza was the undisputed crown jewel of the retail district. I knew the property well. It was an immaculate collection of high-end storefronts featuring imported Italian marble walkways and private security guards. Chloe had opened her luxury fashion boutique there 3 years ago. It was nothing but a massive vanity project, a bottomless financial sinkhole designed exclusively to stroke her fragile ego. She sold imported silk dresses and custom leather handbags that nobody ever bought. She threw lavish champagne parties for her idle friends on Tuesday afternoons, pretending she was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur. She hired young, naive salesgirls to hand out crystal flutes of sparkling wine to anyone wearing designer shoes. She never worried about the astronomical monthly rent or the severe negative profit margins. She never bothered to check the accounting ledgers. She simply forwarded the massive commercial lease invoices directly to Julian, automatically assuming his bank salary would forever cover her vanity. She had absolutely no idea that I was the one paying that invoice every single month. I had anonymously guaranteed the heavy commercial lease through a corporate holding company. The moment I ordered Sterling Pierce to sever the financial lifeline on Friday afternoon, her boutique was exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of corporate real estate law. The protective bubble I placed around her business popped, leaving her defenseless against aggressive collection protocols. Chloe strutted down the marble walkway, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the stone, projecting an aura of absolute superiority. She adjusted her designer coat and lifted her chin, demanding the attention and respect of the passing shoppers. She reached the heavy glass doors of her boutique. The lights inside were completely dark. The expensive mannequins stood in the shadows like silent, mocking ghosts. Chloe reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her heavy brass key. She slid it into the deadbolt on the glass door and turned it with a sharp twist of her wrist. The lock did not budge. She frowned, pulling the key out and trying again, pushing her entire body weight against the thick glass. The heavy door remained completely solid and unyielding. The metal mechanism inside the frame had been completely replaced. She stepped back, frustrated and thoroughly confused. That was when she finally noticed the piece of paper. It was a bright neon orange legal document taped directly to the exact center of the pristine glass door. It was absolutely impossible to miss. Chloe reached out and touched the paper, her heart suddenly pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She pulled down her oversized sunglasses to read the bold black text printed across the top of the official page. Official notice of eviction and commercial lockout. Chloe felt the blood drain entirely from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands began to shake as she read the dense legal jargon printed below the bold heading. The document stated that the commercial tenant was in severe, unrecoverable default. It explicitly detailed 3 consecutive months of unpaid rent, totaling over $45,000 in arrears, plus aggressive late fees, operational penalties, and legal processing costs. The notice proudly declared that the property management firm had officially seized the premises, changed all the exterior and interior locks, and permanently confiscated all interior inventory to help cover the outstanding financial debt. Every silk dress, every leather handbag, every crystal display case now belonged to the landlord. Chloe could not breathe. She pressed her trembling hands against the cold glass, staring at her expensive merchandise locked away in the dark. Her sanctuary, her vanity project, her entire identity as a successful businesswoman was completely gone. Everything she claimed to have built was locked behind a piece of glass she could no longer open. "This is a massive mistake," Chloe whispered to herself, her voice trembling with rising uncontrollable panic. "This has to be a massive administrative error. My husband is a senior bank executive. We do not get evicted. We do not get locked out of our own properties." She spun around, her eyes scanning the immaculate plaza for anyone who could fix her broken reality. She saw the property manager walking out of a nearby luxury coffee shop. He was a tall, sharply dressed man named Harrison. He held a leather clipboard under his arm and a steaming cup of espresso in his hand. Chloe recognized him immediately. She marched toward him, her panic rapidly twisting into explosive, unhinged entitlement. The fear vanished, replaced instantly by the toxic arrogance she used as a defensive weapon against the entire outside world. "Harrison!" she screamed, her voice echoing loudly across the marble courtyard, causing several wealthy shoppers to stop in their tracks and stare at her. "What the hell is the meaning of this? Why is there a brightly colored eviction notice plastered to my storefront? Open my doors right now before I call the police. I have highly exclusive clients coming in for private fittings this afternoon. You are completely ruining my business. You are humiliating me in front of the entire commercial district." Harrison stopped walking. He did not look surprised by her outburst. He did not look intimidated by her threats. He looked at Chloe with the calm, practiced indifference of a man who dealt with bankrupt, angry tenants on a regular basis. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his hot espresso before addressing her. "Good morning, Chloe," Harrison said, his voice flat and professional. "I am afraid I cannot open those doors for you. Your commercial lease has been officially terminated due to severe financial default. Your corporate guarantor withdrew their financial backing entirely on Friday, and your business account has been heavily flagged for insufficient funds. The locks were legally changed at midnight. You no longer have access to this property. You have absolutely no right to do this," Chloe shrieked, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her polished public image. "I am a highly respected business owner in this city. I demand to speak to the building owner immediately. Get the owner on the phone right now." Harrison sighed, clearly tired of her dramatic, empty threats. He reached into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock business card. He extended his arm and handed the card directly to Chloe. "You are more than welcome to contact the property owner yourself," Harrison stated flatly, watching her snatch the card from his fingers. "He is the one who personally authorized the immediate lockout of your specific unit this morning." Chloe glared at the logo printed in heavy embossed silver ink across the center of the business card. The logo read, "Vance Logistics and Real Estate." She stared at the words Vance Logistics. She knew that name. It was the exact holding company that owned her repossessed luxury vehicles. It managed the massive suburban estate she falsely claimed to own. And now she was staring at absolute, undeniable proof that this company owned the commercial plaza. "Who owns this?" she whispered, her voice nothing more than a hollow, terrified gasp. Harrison looked at her with mild disgust. "You should know the answer to that, Chloe. You are married to his son. Victor Rollins is literally your landlord." Chloe was officially completely bankrupt. Chloe returned to the massive suburban estate in the back of a cheap rideshare car. The pristine mansion that once felt like her personal castle now felt like a heavy concrete tomb. She walked through the heavy oak front doors and slammed them shut. The loud echo reverberated through the empty vaulted hallway. Julian was sitting in the formal living room. He was slumped on the expensive Italian leather sofa, holding a crystal glass of cheap whiskey he had found in the back of a cabinet. He looked up at his wife. He expected her to have a plan. He expected the fierce, manipulative woman he married to tell him how they were going to survive. But Chloe was completely empty. Her boutique was gone. Her inventory was seized. Her entire identity was locked behind a glass door in the downtown plaza, and she knew exactly who was responsible. The silence in the living room stretched out until it became completely unbearable. Chloe stared at Julian. The fear in her eyes rapidly twisted into a vicious, toxic hatred. She did not see a partner. She did not see a husband. She saw a weak, pathetic failure who had dragged her into absolute poverty. She walked toward him, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She knocked the crystal glass out of his hand. The glass shattered against the floorboards, spilling amber liquid across the expensive rug. Julian did not even flinch. He just stared at the broken shards of glass, completely paralyzed by his own shame. "Get up, Julian!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Get up and look at what you have done to us. You promised me a life of luxury. You told me you were a powerful executive. You told me you were a self-made man. But you are nothing. You are a weak, pathetic failure. You are just a little boy playing dress-up with your father's money. I married a bank executive, and it turns out I am married to a glorified charity case." Julian tried to speak, but the words caught in his dry throat. Chloe did not let him breathe. She unleashed a dark, venomous rant, completely stripping away his manhood. She told him he was an embarrassment. She told him he was a spineless coward who could not even control his own broke father. She crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She insulted his heritage. She insulted the very blood in his veins, calling him a street rat masquerading in a tailored suit. She told him he was just like the rest of his family, destined to be nothing more than dirty laborers working for the people who actually mattered. She completely emasculated him, tearing down every single delusion of grandeur he had spent his entire adult life building. You cannot even protect your own wife from a senile old truck driver. Chloe spat, her face completely red with absolute fury. "You are not a real man, Julian. You are a joke." Julian stood up slowly. His hands were shaking violently at his sides. He did not yell back. He did not defend his pride because he knew he had no pride left to defend. The illusion of his perfect marriage was completely shattered. The woman he had bankrupted himself to impress had just looked him in the eye and told him he was fundamentally worthless. He walked past her without saying a single word. He walked out the front door and stepped into the cold night air. He did not have his luxury car anymore. He had to walk down the dark suburban street until he reached the main road. He walked for miles. His mind was a chaotic blur of shame, panic, and desperate calculations. He had no money. He had no cars. He had a wife who absolutely despised him. And he had a father who held the keys to his entire existence. Julian knew there was only one way to survive this nightmare. He had to crawl back to the man he had betrayed. He had to beg for his life. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Julian finally reached my quiet neighborhood. The street was dark and silent. He walked up the concrete driveway of my old brick house, the house he had spent his entire life running away from, the house he thought was beneath his elite social status. Now it was the only sanctuary he had left in the entire world. He walked up the wooden steps of my porch. His expensive leather shoes were scuffed and covered in dirt from the long walk. He raised his fist and knocked heavily on the solid wooden door. I was awake. I was sitting in my worn leather recliner staring at the glowing embers in the fireplace. I heard the desperate knocking. I knew exactly who it was. The private investigator had already sent me the audio recording of Chloe screaming at Julian in their living room. The surveillance cameras hidden in the mansion had captured every single vicious word. I knew my son was broken. I knew he was coming to beg for a bailout. I stood up and walked to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Julian stood on the porch shivering in the cold night air. His expensive suit was ruined. His eyes were bloodshot and completely filled with tears. He looked like a terrified, lost child. He did not look like a corporate executive. He looked like a man who had lost his entire soul. "Dad." Julian sobbed, his voice cracking with heavy, pathetic desperation. "Dad, please let me in. I need to talk to you. I have nowhere else to go." I did not move. I stood perfectly still, blocking the doorway with my large frame. I looked down at him with an expression of cold, absolute indifference. "Speak, Julian." I said, my voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet night. Julian fell to his knees on the hard wooden porch. He completely surrendered whatever remaining dignity he possessed. He grabbed the hem of my flannel shirt, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "Dad, I am so sorry," he cried, tears streaming down his face. "I made a massive mistake. Please, you have to help me. I am completely ruined. The bank accounts are frozen. The cars are gone. Chloe is absolutely insane. She is losing her mind. She is the one who wanted to put you in the facility. She is the one who complained about the dirt on the rugs. She manipulated me, Dad. She forced me to go along with it. I listened to him throw his wife completely under the bus. He was willing to sacrifice the woman he married just to save his own skin. He took zero accountability for his own actions. He blamed her for his debt. He blamed her for his arrogance. He blamed her for the absolute disrespect he had shown his own father. "Please, Dad," Julian begged, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. "You have $50 million. I know about the plaza. I know about the trust fund. You can fix all of this with a single phone call. Just write me a check. Just give me enough to pay off the debt and get my life back. I will divorce Chloe. I will do whatever you want. I will be a good son. Just make it all go away." I stared down at the pathetic, crying man kneeling on my porch. I did not feel pity. I did not feel paternal warmth. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute disgust. I had spent 40 years breaking my back on loading docks and driving freight trucks across the country to build a legacy of strength and integrity. And this terrified, sniveling coward was the result of all my sacrifice. He was willing to sell out his wife, his pride, and his own flesh and blood for a piece of paper with some numbers written on it. I reached down and grabbed his hands. I pulled his fingers off my flannel shirt, pushing his hands away with definitive force. Julian stayed on his knees, looking up at me, waiting for the salvation he thought he was owed. "A man who lets his wife humiliate his father at the dinner table," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper, "then sells out his wife in the middle of the night to beg for a check is no son of mine." Julian froze. The tears stopped flowing. The desperate hope in his eyes shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He realized in that exact moment that there was no financial rescue coming. There was no secret safety net left to catch him. The bank of his father was permanently, completely closed. "You are a weak man, Julian." I continued, delivering the final lethal blow to his ego. "You built a fake life with my money, and the moment the money vanished, you crumbled into nothing. I will not fund your cowardice for another single second. Do not ever come to this house again." I stepped back into the warm hallway and firmly pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the cold night air. I walked back to my leather recliner and sat down, leaving my son kneeling alone on the dark porch. Outside on the wooden planks, Julian slowly stood up. The devastating rejection washed over him completely, wiping away his desperate sadness. The tears dried on his cheeks. His immense, crippling shame rapidly morphed into pure, concentrated hatred. His father had the power to save him from absolute ruin and deliberately chose to watch him drown. He clenched his fists so tightly his fingernails dug deep into his palms. He stared at the locked wooden door with eyes full of violent, dark resentment. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his ruined suit jacket. If his father wanted to destroy him, he would not go down alone. He would go to the courthouse tomorrow morning. He would use the fake medical evaluation. He would use every dirty, manipulative trick he had left to completely destroy the man who had just locked him out in the cold. Julian walked back down the empty suburban street, completely enveloped by the darkness of the early morning hours. The cold wind bit through the thin fabric of his expensive suit jacket, but he could no longer feel the physical discomfort. His mind was entirely consumed by the crushing weight of his ultimate rejection. For 42 years, he had secretly believed that he was inherently better than the rough blue-collar world his father represented. He had spent his entire adult life distancing himself from the grease and the grime of the logistics business, preferring the sanitized illusion of corporate banking. But standing on that wooden porch begging for a handout, he finally realized the absolute truth. His father was a self-made titan holding $50 million in silent, invisible power. And Julian was nothing more than a hollow, fragile shell. The hatred burning inside his chest was the only thing keeping him moving forward. He hated Chloe for dragging him into this massive financial sinkhole. He hated his father for revealing his complete inadequacy. But most of all, he hated himself for being weak enough to lose everything. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket. The screen illuminated his face in the pitch-black night. He opened his encrypted messaging application and typed a rapid, frantic message to the corrupt psychiatrist Dr. Evans. The message was short and completely devoid of any remaining morality. He told the doctor to finalize the fraudulent medical documents immediately. He declared that he no longer cared about the consequences or the legal risks. He wanted the emergency conservatorship paperwork filed the absolute second the courthouse doors opened in the morning. He was fully prepared to stand in front of a judge and swear under oath that his father was a dangerously insane old man. Julian slid the phone back into his pocket and quickened his pace. He did not care about the truth anymore. He did not care about family loyalty or the sacrifices his father had made decades ago. He only cared about survival and revenge. He was ready to walk into the courtroom and completely dismantle the empire his father had built. He was ready to unleash absolute, total war. Saturday mornings were meant for baseball. For the past 3 years, I had never missed a single one of my grandson Leo and his Little League games. I sat on the cold aluminum bleachers holding a paper cup of black coffee, waiting to see that bright 8-year-old boy run out onto the dirt field wearing his oversized jersey. Leo was the only pure thing left in that entire toxic family. He had my late wife Loretta and her kind eyes. He had a good heart that had not yet been corrupted by the suffocating greed of his parents. The game was scheduled to start at 9 in the morning. By 9:15, the umpire was calling the teams to the diamond. Leo was nowhere to be found. I pulled my cheap flip phone from my jacket pocket. I dialed Julian first. The call went straight to a generic automated voicemail. I dialed Chloe next. The phone did not even ring. It simply disconnected. She had completely blocked my number. A cold, sharp knot of realization tightened in my chest. I knew exactly what they were doing. When weak people lose their financial power, they resort to emotional terrorism. My phone buzzed in my palm. A single text message pushed through from an unknown digital web number Chloe was using to hide her location. I opened the message. The text was short, vicious, and completely unambiguous. I pulled Leo out of the league. You are never going to see your grandson again. Sign over the entire Rollins Trust to Julian today, or I will make sure Leo forgets you ever existed. Do not try to find us. She was using an 8-year-old child as a human shield. She was using my own flesh and blood as leverage to extort a $50 million fortune. Most grandfathers would have panicked. Most men would have crumbled under the sheer emotional weight of losing access to their beloved grandson. They would have called their lawyers and begged to negotiate a settlement to keep the peace. But I am not most men. I built an empire by negotiating with ruthless corporate sharks and aggressive union bosses. You never negotiate with an extortionist. The moment you give them a single inch, they will take your entire life and demand more. Chloe thought she was playing a brilliant game of psychological chess. She thought she had found my ultimate weakness. She had absolutely no idea that she had just crossed the one unforgivable boundary that guaranteed her absolute total destruction. I did not reply to her threatening text message. I did not give her the satisfaction of a panicked response. I stood up from the cold aluminum bleachers, threw my half-empty coffee cup into a nearby trash can, and walked back to my rusted Ford truck. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors. I pulled out my encrypted smartphone, the one provided by my wealth manager. I dialed Sterling Pierce. Sterling answered on the first ring. He knew my schedule. He knew I was supposed to be at a baseball game. Sterling. I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed in the quiet cabin of the truck. Chloe just crossed the red line. She pulled Leo from his game. She sent an extortion text demanding the trust fund in exchange for access to my grandson. I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Sterling was a ruthless lawyer, but even he understood the sheer depravity of using a child as a financial hostage. "What are your orders, Victor?" he asked, his tone instantly shifting from a casual weekend greeting to absolute military precision. "I want the nuclear option," I commanded. "I want you to unleash the private investigators. Do not just look at her failed boutique. Do not just look at her current credit card debt. I want them to dig into every single second of her miserable life. I want her bank records. I want her internet search history. I want her private encrypted messages. Find every dirty secret she has ever tried to hide. Spare absolutely no expense. I want a complete psychological and financial autopsy on my desk by Monday morning." "Consider it done," Sterling replied. "We will tear her entire life apart, brick by brick." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in absolute cold discipline. I sat in my quiet brick house while the storm raged completely out of sight. I knew Julian was too weak to stop his wife from using their own child as a weapon. He was likely sitting in a cheap motel room, completely paralyzed by his own massive failures, letting Chloe steer the sinking ship. She was probably checking her phone every 5 minutes, expecting me to surrender, expecting a frantic apology, expecting the millions to suddenly appear in their frozen bank accounts. She was waiting for me to break. Instead, my investigators were breaking her. Sterling had deployed a team of elite private intelligence contractors. These were not cheap street detectives snapping blurry photos through a telephoto lens. These were former federal financial crimes analysts and cybersecurity experts. They had the digital tools to bypass basic security measures and track the hidden flow of money across international borders. They hunted for the invisible breadcrumbs that greedy people always leave behind when they think nobody's watching. I spent the weekend restoring an old wooden rocking chair in my garage. I sanded down the rough edges, working the coarse paper against the grain. I kept my hands busy. I kept my mind completely focused on the exact sequence of legal maneuvers I was about to execute. I did not feel sad. I felt the sharp, cold edge of absolute justice preparing to strike. When someone threatens to take away the only innocent family member you have left, you do not just cut off their money. You obliterate their entire foundation so they can never rise up and threaten you again. Monday morning arrived with heavy gray clouds covering the suburban sky. It looked exactly like the storm I was about to unleash. At precisely 8 in the morning, a sleek black sport utility vehicle pulled into my cracked concrete driveway. A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark suit stepped out. He was the lead investigator for the intelligence firm. He carried a thick, heavy black leather folder under his arm. I opened my front door before he even reached the wooden porch steps. He walked into my living room without saying a word. He set the heavy folder down on my solid oak coffee table. He unclasped the metal buckle and flipped the cover open. "Good morning, Victor," the investigator said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You asked us to tear her life apart. We found something significantly worse than a failed boutique and a massive shopping addiction. Your daughter-in-law is not just an entitled gold digger. She is an active federal criminal." I sat down in my leather recliner and leaned forward. "Show me," I demanded. The investigator pulled out a stack of certified financial wire transfer receipts. He spread them out across the wooden table like a deck of playing cards. "We started digging into her private financial activities over the past 12 months, the investigator explained, pointing to the top document. "We noticed a consistent pattern of highly structured cash withdrawals from Julian and his corporate retirement accounts. She was deliberately pulling amounts just under the federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering any automatic fraud alerts." I stared at the numbers. They were massive. She was systematically bleeding his long-term savings dry. Where did she put the money? I asked, my eyes scanning the highlighted columns. The investigator pulled out another highly classified document displaying a complex web of international routing numbers. She did not spend it on designer clothes or luxury vacations. She was preparing an escape hatch. For the past year, Chloe has been secretly siphoning Julian and his remaining 401k funds, completely draining his retirement savings and routing the stolen money through a series of anonymous shell companies. The final destination is a highly secure offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. The account is registered exclusively in her maiden name. Julian has absolutely no idea the account even exists. I felt a cold, hard smile form on my lips. The absolute magnitude of her betrayal was staggering. She was not just robbing me by proxy. She was actively robbing her own husband. She knew Julian was a weak, sinking ship. She knew their luxurious lifestyle was built on fragile, borrowed time. While she was playing the role of the perfect wealthy wife at the country club, she was secretly embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own marriage, preparing to abandon him the moment the money finally ran out. She was planning to leave him, I stated, looking up at the investigator. The investigator nodded, tapping the final document in the folder. That is our exact professional assessment. She was building an untraceable offshore nest egg. We also recovered deleted search history from her personal laptop. She has been researching high-net-worth divorce attorneys and international custody laws for the past 6 months. She was planning to steal his entire retirement fund file for a highly contested divorce and attempt to flee the jurisdiction with your grandson. Your financial cutoff on Friday simply accelerated a timeline she had already put into motion. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. Chloe thought she was a master manipulator. She thought sending a text message threatening my access to Leo would force me to sign over a $50 million trust fund. She believed she held the ultimate trump card. She had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding certified, undeniable proof of her massive offshore embezzlement scheme. She had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to completely strip her of her maternal rights and banish her to the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. I looked at the investigator. Does Sterling have digital copies of these documents? I asked. He has everything, the investigator confirmed. He is currently drafting the emergency legal filings as we speak. I closed the black leather folder, feeling the solid weight of total victory under my hands. Chloe wanted to play a dirty game using my grandson as a hostage. She was about to discover what happens when you bring an empty threat to a billionaire who has already bought and paid for your absolute destruction. It was time to go to court. The heavy wooden double doors of the county probate courthouse swung shut behind me. They sealed us inside a room built entirely for judgment and consequence. The air smelled of lemon floor polish and the stale, anxious sweat of desperate people. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. My posture was perfectly straight. My steps were measured and deliberate. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that I had not taken out of my closet since the day I sold my logistics empire. Beside me walked Sterling Pierce. He was my wealth manager and lead attorney. He carried a slim black leather briefcase. That briefcase contained the absolute destruction of my son and his wife. We took our seats at the heavy oak defense table. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood. I looked across the center aisle to the plaintiff table. Julian and Chloe were already seated. They had hired a notoriously aggressive probate lawyer named Marcus Vance. I knew exactly who he was. He was the kind of high-priced legal shark who charged a massive retainer to push emergency guardianship cases through the court system. I also knew that Chloe had paid his retainer using the stolen funds she had scraped together from liquidating her failed boutique and emptying Julian's depleted savings accounts. Julian wore a wrinkled navy suit. He looked like a man who had not slept in 4 days. His skin was pale and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He refused to look in my direction. He kept his head completely bowed, staring at his legal notepad. He was a coward, walking into a slaughterhouse, desperately hoping he would not be the one bleeding at the end of the day. Chloe, however, was playing the role of a lifetime. She wore a modest, high-collared beige dress. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a simple conservative clip. She wore minimal makeup intentionally, making herself look exhausted and completely drained by the heavy burden of caring for a sick relative. She clutched a white tissue in her trembling hands. When she glanced over at me, her eyes were wide and sorrowful for the benefit of the bailiffs and the court clerks. But beneath that fabricated mask of absolute tragedy, I could see the cold, feral greed burning in her pupils. She thought she was holding the winning lottery ticket. She thought this courtroom was simply a formality before she gained total access to my bank accounts. The heavy side door opened, and the bailiff instructed everyone to rise. Judge Abernathy took his seat at the high wooden bench. He was an older man with a stern face and a reputation for taking elder abuse cases very seriously. He arranged his reading glasses and opened the thick file resting on his desk. "We are here today to hear an emergency petition for a medical and financial conservatorship regarding Mr. Victor Rollins," Judge Abernathy announced. His voice echoed deeply through the quiet courtroom. "Counsel for the petitioners, you may proceed." Marcus Vance stood up. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and walked confidently toward the center podium. He placed a thick stack of papers on the wooden stand. He looked up at the judge with an expression of deep professional sorrow. "Your Honor," Vance began, his voice smooth and highly persuasive, "we are here today out of absolute, tragic necessity. My clients Julian and Chloe Rollins are standing before you to save the life of a man they love dearly. Victor Rollins is 73 years old. He has been a pillar of his community. He was a hardworking man for decades, but recently a dark and terrible shadow has fallen over his mind. He is currently suffering from a rapid, aggressive, and highly dangerous form of cognitive decline." Vance paused, letting the dramatic weight of his words settle over the courtroom. He turned and gestured toward me with a sympathetic wave of his hand. "Over the past few weeks, his mental state has deteriorated to a terrifying degree," Vance continued. "He is experiencing severe paranoid delusions. He believes he is a powerful corporate executive. He wanders the streets. He maliciously cancels important financial guarantees because he no longer understands the basic concepts of banking or family obligation. He has become a massive danger to himself and to the financial stability of his own household. My clients have tried everything to help him. They have offered him in-home care. They have begged him to seek medical treatment. But his paranoia has made him violently resistant to their love." Judge Abernathy listened closely, making a few notes on his legal pad. He looked down at Chloe. "Mrs. Rollins," the judge said, "do you have anything to add to your attorney's statement?" Chloe stood up slowly. Her hands trembled violently. She clutched the white tissue to her chest. She took a deep, shaky breath, allowing a single tear to roll down her cheek. It was a masterful, sociopathic performance. "Your Honor," Chloe whimpered, her voice cracking perfectly. "I love my father-in-law. I love him so much, but we are absolutely terrified. Just the other day, he completely forgot where he was. He locked himself inside his house and threatened to call the police on his own son. He is destroying his own life. We just want to protect him. We want to place him in a safe, secure medical facility where he can get the round-the-clock care he so desperately needs. We do not want him to hurt himself. Please, Your Honor, you have to give us the authority to save him before it is too late." She wiped her eyes and sat back down, burying her face in Julian's shoulder. Julian awkwardly patted her back, still refusing to look anywhere near my table. The judge nodded sympathetically. He turned his attention back to their lawyer. "Mr. Vance, these are very serious allegations. Stripping a man of his legal autonomy is the most severe action this court can take. Do you have certified medical proof to back up these claims?" Vance smiled confidently. He reached into his legal folder and pulled out a heavy document stamped with a red official seal. "We absolutely do, Your Honor," Vance declared loudly. "I am submitting to the court an official comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted just 3 days ago by Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans is a highly respected board-certified psychiatrist in this county." Vance handed the document to the court bailiff, who walked it up to the judge. "Your Honor?" Vance continued pacing back and forth in front of the podium. Dr. Evans spent significant time evaluating Mr. Rollins. The medical conclusions are completely undeniable. Dr. Evans has officially diagnosed Victor Rollins with late-stage neurodegenerative disease severely complicated by aggressive paranoid schizophrenia. The doctor explicitly states that Victor lacks the fundamental mental capacity to manage his own medical care, his real estate, or his financial assets. Vance leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium, his voice dropping into a demanding, authoritative tone. "Therefore, Your Honor, we are filing an emergency petition to immediately transfer full, unrestricted conservatorship to his son, Julian Rollins. We demand immediate legal control over all of Victor Rollins and his bank accounts, his property deeds, and his medical decisions. We must freeze his assets today to safeguard his estate from his own destructive, senile behavior. If you do not grant this emergency order today, Victor will completely bankrupt himself by tomorrow." Chloe sniffled softly from her chair, nodding in agreement. She was practically tasting the money. She believed the judge was about to hand her the keys to my entire kingdom. She thought she had completely outsmarted me. She thought her $50,000 bribe to Dr. Evans was the greatest investment she had ever made. Judge Abernathy adjusted his reading glasses. He opened the psychiatric evaluation and read through the pages in complete silence. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. The judge frowned slightly as he read the clinical descriptions of my supposed insanity. The report was incredibly detailed, filled with complex medical jargon and absolute lies. Judge Abernathy closed the file and folded his hands on his desk. He looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with a mixture of professional duty and genuine human pity. "Mr. Rollins," the judge said gently, "I have read the medical evaluation. The findings presented by Dr. Evans are extremely concerning. The court takes the safety of its senior citizens very seriously. Do you or your legal counsel have anything to say before I make my ruling on this emergency petition?" Across the aisle, Chloe lowered her tissue. She stared at me. A wicked, victorious smirk flashed across her face for just a fraction of a second. She was daring me to speak. She wanted me to yell. She wanted me to stand up and angrily deny the charges because she knew that an angry, shouting old man would only prove the doctor's diagnosis of aggressive paranoia. She wanted me to dig my own grave right there in front of the judge. I did not react. I did not glare at her. I remained perfectly calm, completely still, and utterly silent. I simply turned my head and looked at Sterling Pierce. Sterling Pierce stood up. He did not rush. He took his time. He calmly buttoned the center button of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He picked up his slim black leather briefcase and walked gracefully to the defense podium. He did not look panicked. He did not look intimidated by the aggressive posturing of the opposing counsel. He looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey in a dead-end canyon. Sterling looked at Julian. Then he looked at Chloe, his eyes locking onto hers with a cold, piercing intensity that instantly wiped the victorious smirk right off her face. Finally, he turned his attention to the bench. Sterling Pierce smiled. It was a very polite, incredibly lethal smile, the kind of smile that promised absolute devastation. "We do have a response, Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "The defense firmly rejects every single allegation made by the petitioners today. Furthermore, we firmly reject the validity of the medical evaluation submitted to this court." Marcus Vance scoffed loudly from his table. "Your Honor, that is a certified medical document signed by a board-certified psychiatrist. The defense cannot simply reject a professional medical diagnosis because they do not like the results." Sterling ignored the interruption completely. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small metallic digital storage drive. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger so the entire courtroom could see it. "We are not rejecting the medical evaluation because we do not like the results, Your Honor," Sterling explained calmly. "We are rejecting the medical evaluation because we possess absolute undeniable proof that the document currently resting on your desk is a fraudulent, fabricated piece of fiction entirely purchased through a criminal bribe." The air in the courtroom instantly vanished. Julian gasped, his hands gripping the edge of his wooden table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Chloe sat bolt upright in her chair, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. Sterling turned to face the opposing counsel, his smile widening just a fraction of an inch. The earthquake was here, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Sterling Pierce stood at the podium holding the small metallic flash drive high in the air. Marcus Vance, the opposing counsel, slammed his hands flat against his table and jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I object," Vance shouted, his voice echoing with sudden panic. "This is a highly irregular ambush. The defense cannot introduce unverified digital media into a medical conservatorship hearing without prior discovery. We have no idea what is on that drive. It could be digitally altered. It could be completely fabricated." Judge Abernathy glared down from the bench. He looked at the frantic opposing counsel and then looked at my attorney. "Mr. Pierce," the judge said sternly, "you are making an incredibly serious accusation. You are accusing a licensed medical professional and the petitioners of a criminal conspiracy. What exactly is on that storage device?" Sterling did not flinch. "Your Honor, This drive contains unedited, high-definition video and audio surveillance footage recorded inside my client's private residence just yesterday afternoon. Sterling explained, his voice calm and lethal. It captures the exact moment the psychiatric evaluation currently resting on your desk was verbally negotiated and financially purchased. I watched Chloe out of the corner of my eye. All the color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale white. She grabbed Julian's arm, her manicured fingernails digging deep into his cheap suit jacket. Julian looked like he was about to physically vomit. He knew exactly what had happened in my living room. He knew what they had done. Judge Abernathy narrowed his eyes. The tension in the room was thick and suffocating. The judge looked at Dr. Evans, who was sitting in the gallery directly behind the plaintiff table. The corrupt psychiatrist had attended the hearing to testify to my supposed insanity. Now he was sweating profusely, tugging at his expensive silk tie. "I will allow it." Judge Abernathy ruled, banging his wooden gavel once. "Bailiff, please take the drive and play it on the main courtroom monitors. If this is a baseless stunt, Mr. Pierce, I will hold you in contempt of court." Sterling handed the drive to the bailiff with a polite nod. "I assure you, Your Honor, there is absolutely no stunt being played today." The bailiff plugged the metallic drive into the court computer system. 3 large, flat-screen monitors hanging on the courtroom walls flickered to life. Chloe began to shake violently in her chair. She whispered frantically to Marcus Vance, but the lawyer just held up his hand, telling her to be quiet. He needed to see what he was up against. The video started playing. The quality was absolutely pristine. Sterling had spared no expense on the hidden cameras. The screen displayed my living room in crystal-clear 4K resolution. The audio was so sharp you could hear the faint ticking of my grandfather clock in the background. On the monitors, the entire courtroom watched as the 4 of us sat in my living room. They saw me acting frail and hunched over. They saw Dr. Evans sitting on my floral sofa asking condescending questions. They heard Chloe lying smoothly about my supposed paranoia and my imaginary corporate delusions. Then the video showed me slowly standing up. It showed me shuffling down the hallway and locking the bathroom door behind me. The moment the bathroom door clicked shut on the video, the entire atmosphere in the digital recording changed. The courtroom audience gasped collectively as they watched Chloe drop her sweet, concerned daughter-in-law routine entirely. Her face on the giant screens twisted into a mask of pure, ruthless greed. The high-definition audio picked up every single whisper with devastating clarity. The entire legal assembly watched as Chloe reached into her oversized designer handbag. They watched her pull out a thick, bulging manila envelope. "Your Honor," Vance stammered, trying to stand up again. "This is a violation of privacy." "Sit down and remain silent, Mr. Vance," Judge Abernathy commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority. His eyes were glued to the monitor. On the screen, Chloe stepped over to Dr. Evans and shoved the heavy envelope directly into his hands. The doctor smiled, a greasy, satisfied smile. He ran his thumb over the unsealed flap, verifying the thick stacks of $100 bills waiting inside. He folded the envelope and slid it deep into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit. Then the crystal-clear audio echoed through the silent courtroom. "Write the late-stage Alzheimer's report tonight," Chloe demanded on the video, her voice sharp and vicious. "Make it bulletproof. I want the language to clearly state he is an immediate danger to himself and others. I want it on my desk by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We file for emergency guardianship tomorrow at the courthouse. Once we get the judge to sign the conservatorship, I will pay you the remaining 50% of our agreed-upon total." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic chorus of shocked whispers. Julian hid his face in his hands on the screen, and in real life. The video continued playing, showing the ultimate betrayal. "Do not worry, Chloe," Dr. Evans whispered back on the recording, his voice dripping with professional corruption. "I will make sure the medical evaluation is entirely comprehensive. The court will not ask any questions. He will be legally incapacitated before the weekend. You will have full financial control." The video ended. The screens faded to black. For a long, agonizing moment, the courtroom was completely silent. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive natural disaster. Judge Abernathy slowly took off his reading glasses. His face had turned a deep, violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging. He had spent his entire judicial career protecting the elderly from predatory family members, and he had just witnessed a textbook case of medical extortion and elder abuse playing out in high definition right in front of his eyes. He looked down at the fabricated medical report resting on his desk. He picked up the document and threw it forcefully across his bench. The papers scattered and fluttered to the floor. Dr. Evans, Judge Abernathy roared, his voice cracking like thunder. "Do not move a single muscle. Bailiffs, secure the doors." Dr. Evans jumped up from his seat in the gallery. His face was completely pale. He looked around wildly like a trapped rat looking for an escape route, but two large armed bailiffs were already moving swiftly down the aisle. "Your Honor, I can explain," Dr. Evans stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "That video is taken completely out of context. It was a private consultation fee." "You will explain it to the district attorney," Judge Abernathy shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the corrupt psychiatrist. "You have just committed perjury, bribery, and medical fraud in my courtroom. You have attempted to weaponize the judicial system to steal a man's life. Bailiffs, place that man under arrest immediately." The bailiffs grabbed Dr. Evans by the arms. They slammed him against the wooden gallery pews and secured heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. The sound of the ratcheting metal echoed through the room. They marched the disgraced doctor out of the courtroom while he hung his head in absolute humiliation. His career, his freedom, and his life were completely over. Chloe was shaking so violently she could barely stay in her chair. She was sobbing uncontrollably, but it was not an act this time. It was the pure raw terror of a criminal who had just been caught red-handed. Marcus Vance, her expensive shark of a lawyer, was frantically packing his documents into his briefcase. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with this case anymore. He was trying to distance himself from the toxic fallout of a federal crime. Judge Abernathy turned his furious gaze toward the plaintiff table. "Julian and Chloe Rollins," he said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "In all my years on the bench, I have never seen a more despicable, cowardly, and thoroughly documented attempt at elder abuse. You conspired to strip a sane man of his human rights simply because you wanted access to his bank accounts." "Your Honor, please," Chloe cried, her voice completely hysterical. "I was just trying to help him." "The video makes it look worse than it is. We are broke. We just needed a little bit of money." "You do not speak," Judge Abernathy snapped, cutting her off instantly. "You have entirely surrendered your right to be heard in this court. I am dismissing this petition for emergency conservatorship with extreme prejudice. I am also forwarding a full unredacted copy of that surveillance video directly to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution regarding your conspiracy to commit fraud." Julian let out a loud, pathetic sob. He buried his head in his arms on the defense table, completely paralyzed by his own massive failure. He had lost everything. The judge took a deep breath, trying to compose his judicial temperament. He looked over at me and Sterling Pierce. His expression softened significantly. "Mr. Rollins," the judge said respectfully, "I sincerely apologize that you had to endure this horrific betrayal by your own family. The court recognizes that you are in full possession of your mental faculties. The medical evaluation has been completely stricken from the official record." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. However, Judge Abernathy continued, picking up his pen. "As a matter of strict legal protocol, I cannot officially close this specific docket until I verify that the ward in question is not in any immediate financial distress. The petitioners allege that you were destitute and unable to provide for your own basic needs. In order to permanently seal this case and formally dismiss all claims of financial vulnerability, I must ask your counsel to submit a certified declaration of your current financial assets. I just need to see that you are capable of supporting yourself without state intervention." It was a standard procedural requirement to close a dismissed guardianship case. The judge just needed to see a bank statement proving I had enough money to buy groceries and pay my property taxes. Chloe sniffled from her table, wiping her ruined makeup. She looked over at me with a sudden, desperate glimmer of spite in her eyes. Even though she was facing criminal charges, she still believed I was a broke old man. She still thought my financial exposure would embarrass me in front of the judge. She still clung to the delusion that she was fundamentally better than me. Sterling Pierce did not hesitate. He smiled that cold, lethal smile once again. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, securely bound financial dossier. "We are more than happy to comply with the procedural requirements, Your Honor," Sterling announced, walking confidently back to the center podium. "The defense submits into the official court record the certified audited financial statements of Mr. Victor Rollins. The earthquake had leveled their false accusations, but the tsunami was about to hit. The courtroom was about to learn exactly who Victor Rollins really was." Sterling Pierce walked toward the heavy wooden bench of the judge with absolute confidence. He did not rush. He held a thick black leather binder in his right hand. The courtroom was still recovering from the explosive revelation of the hidden camera footage. The air was heavy with the aftermath of Dr. Evans being arrested and dragged away by the armed bailiffs. Judge Abernathy was still breathing heavily from his righteous anger. He reached out and took the black leather binder from Sterling. The judge simply wanted to see a basic checking account statement. He needed to verify that I could afford my groceries and pay my property taxes so he could officially close this miserable guardianship case. He expected to see a meager Social Security deposit. He expected to see a fragile safety net of a few $1,000s. Sterling turned away from the bench. He walked over to the plaintiff table where Julian and Chloe sat in absolute ruin. Marcus Vance, their expensive lawyer, was still frantically shoving his legal pads into his briefcase. He wanted to run out of the courtroom and pretend he had never met my son. Sterling stopped in front of their table. He placed a duplicate copy of the black leather binder directly in front of Julian. Sterling tapped the cover of the binder twice with his index finger. He did not say a single word. He just smiled that cold, lethal smile and walked back to sit beside me at the defense table. Judge Abernathy adjusted his reading glasses. He opened the heavy cover of the financial dossier. I watched the judge's face closely. At first, his expression was completely neutral. He flipped past the title page. He looked at the first certified bank statement, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in deep confusion. He leaned closer to the paperwork as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He flipped to the second page, then the third, then the fourth. The neutral expression completely vanished. His jaw dropped open. His eyes widened behind his thick glass lenses. He was staring at a certified summary of my liquid assets, municipal bonds, offshore holding companies, and corporate real estate portfolios. The judge slowly took off his glasses. He looked up from the documents and stared directly at me. The look of gentle human pity he had given me just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. It was replaced by a look of absolute, profound respect. Judge Abernathy was a man who understood power. He understood that the quiet, elderly black man sitting at the defense table in a modest suit was not a helpless victim. I was an absolute titan hiding in plain sight. The judge cleared his throat heavily. He closed the binder and placed his hands flat on top of it. "Mr. Rollins," the judge said, his voice entirely different now. It was deferential and incredibly polite. "The court has reviewed your certified financial statements. I can confidently say that you are in no immediate financial distress. You are more than capable of providing for your own care. This emergency conservatorship petition is permanently dismissed with extreme prejudice. You are completely free to go, sir." At the plaintiff table, Marcus Vance stopped packing his briefcase. His intense legal curiosity got the better of his panic. He reached over and flipped open the duplicate binder Sterling had left on the table. Vance was a man who worshipped wealth. He scanned the top summary page. The expensive lawyer physically flinched. He let out a sharp gasp that echoed in the quiet courtroom. He realized in that exact moment that he had chosen the wrong side of a massive financial war. He had tied his legal reputation to a broke, desperate couple trying to steal from a man who could buy his entire law firm with a single phone call. Vance slowly slid the open binder across the wooden table until it rested directly in front of Julian and Chloe. "Look at this," Vance whispered harshly to his clients. "Look at exactly who you tried to destroy." Julian looked down at the crisp white paper. His bloodshot eyes scanned the bold black text. He saw the official letterheads from the most exclusive private wealth management banks in the world. He saw columns of numbers that stretched across the page. He dragged his trembling finger down to the final line of the summary page. The bottom line detailed my total consolidated net worth. Julian stared at the final number. $50 million. He read it again. $50 million in fully liquid, highly diversified, and perfectly secure assets. The realization hit Julian with the force of a speeding freight train. He stopped breathing. The air completely evacuated his lungs. He was 42 years old. He was a mid-level bank executive drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of toxic credit card debt. He had spent his entire life trying to project an image of absolute wealth. He bought tailored suits he could not afford. He leased luxury cars he did not own. He joined expensive country clubs just to feel important. He had looked down on me for driving a rusted truck and living in an old brick house. He thought I was a pathetic failure who had wasted my life working a dirty blue-collar job. Now sitting in a quiet courtroom, Julian finally understood the sheer magnitude of his own stupidity. His father was a multimillionaire. His father possessed the exact kind of generational wealth that Julian had spent his entire life desperately pretending to have. I had $50 million sitting quietly in the dark. And Julian had just permanently destroyed his relationship with me for absolutely nothing. He had thrown away his only chance at inheriting an actual empire because he was too impatient to wait and too arrogant to respect the man who built it. Julian buried his face in his hands and began to weep. It was a hollow, ugly sound. It was the sound of a man mourning the death of his own future. Chloe sat frozen next to her crying husband. She stared at the bold, black number at the bottom of the page. $50 million. Her mind could not process the information. Just an hour ago, she truly believed I was a broke, helpless pensioner. She believed she was the sophisticated, intelligent predator manipulating a senile old fool. She had called me useless. She had complained about the dirt on my boots. She had paid a corrupt doctor $50,000 stolen dollars to lock me in a state-funded warehouse just so she could steal a small house and a modest pension. She looked at the number again. $50 million. I watched her reaction from across the center aisle. I saw the exact moment the shock wore off. I saw the absolute terror of her impending criminal charges completely vanish from her eyes. It was replaced by something dark, feral, and incredibly dangerous. Chloe was a pure sociopath. She did not feel remorse for her actions. She did not feel guilty for trying to destroy my life. She only felt a sudden explosive surge of pure greedy hunger. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes dilated as they locked onto the printed numbers. The gears in her mind began to turn with frantic, manic energy. She completely forgot about the fake medical report. She forgot about the arrest of Dr. Evans. She forgot about the looming threat of the district attorney and the federal fraud investigation. All she saw was the money, $50 million. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of in her entire shallow life. It was enough money to buy a dozen luxury boutiques. It was enough money to fly private jets to Europe for the rest of her life. She started mentally spending the money right there at the plaintiff table. She imagined the massive mansions she could buy. She imagined the exclusive country clubs that would be forced to accept her. She completely ignored the fact that I was still alive and sitting right across from her. In her mind, I was already gone, and my wealth was her personal playground. She was convinced that the legal system would protect her status as a wife. She assumed that marital asset laws would guarantee her a massive payout the moment she decided to file the paperwork and abandon her broken husband. She looked at Julian. He was still crying miserably into his hands. Chloe looked at him not with pity but with intense, predatory calculation. She was married to Julian. Julian was my only son. Julian was my only heir. In her twisted, desperate mind, she immediately constructed a brand new reality. She reasoned that because she was legally married to Julian, she was automatically entitled to half of everything he would eventually inherit. She believed she had just won the ultimate lottery. Chloe slowly lifted her head. She looked across the courtroom directly at me. Her tears were completely gone. Her facade of the exhausted, caring daughter-in-law was totally abandoned. She stared at me with a cold, vicious entitlement. She was no longer looking at a human being. She was looking at a massive bank vault, and she was absolutely convinced she already held the combination. She believed that no matter how much I hated her, I could not stop the natural flow of inheritance. She believed that $50 million would eventually fall right into her lap. I looked back at her. My expression remained entirely blank and unbothered. I knew exactly what she was thinking. I knew she was calculating her divorce settlement. I knew she was planning to tear Julian apart in family court to secure her piece of the pie. She thought she could take my grandson hostage, use him as leverage, and force Julian to hand over millions of dollars to make her go away. She was plotting her ultimate escape. She was designing a brand new, luxurious future built entirely on my fortune. She thought she had finally found the silver lining to this disastrous morning. She thought her massive gamble was going to pay off in the end. She had absolutely no idea about the trap I had already set. She did not know about the ironclad legal clauses buried deep within the Rollins Trust. She did not know that the $50 million was surrounded by impenetrable legal armor designed specifically to obliterate people exactly like her. She was staring at a mirage in the desert, completely unaware that she was about to walk straight off a cliff. I stood up from the defense table. Sterling Pierce closed his briefcase and stood beside me. Judge Abernathy nodded to us respectfully. We turned our backs on Julian and Chloe. We walked down the center aisle and pushed open the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom. We walked out into the bright morning sunlight, leaving the greedy, desperate predators locked inside the dark room to rot in their own delusions. The courtroom battle was officially over, but the final execution had just begun. That night, the air in my old brick house felt exceptionally still. I sat in my leather recliner watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The events of the morning had sent shockwaves through the entire legal district, but I knew the war was not over yet. A predatory animal does not stop hunting just because it misses its first strike. It simply changes tactics. Chloe had looked at my certified financial statements in that courtroom and seen a $50 million prize. I knew she was spending the evening plotting a new way to steal it. My private investigator confirmed my suspicions less than 12 hours after the judge dismissed the emergency conservatorship. At exactly 8 o'clock that night, my encrypted smartphone buzzed with a secure message. The investigator had intercepted digital court filings from the County Family Law Division. Chloe had officially filed for a highly contested divorce from Julian. Her master plan was incredibly transparent and completely devoid of any human decency. She knew Julian was entirely broke, but she honestly believed that because he was my only son, he was guaranteed to inherit my entire fortune. In her twisted, desperate mind, filing for divorce right now was the ultimate strategic maneuver. She planned to demand full legal and physical custody of my grandson Leo. Then she would drag Julian through a vicious family court battle demanding an exorbitant settlement based on his status as the sole heir to a $50 million logistics empire. She wanted to secure a massive slice of my wealth before Julian even had a chance to touch it. I knew she would not wait for the legal process to play out naturally. Greed makes people impatient, and Chloe was the most impatient person I had ever met. She needed cash immediately. She needed a victory to soothe her shattered ego. I expected her to make a desperate move, and I did not have to wait long. At 9:15, the bright headlights of her cheap economy rental car swept across my living room windows. The engine sputtered as she put the vehicle into park on the street outside my house. I stood up and walked to the front window. Chloe was marching up my concrete driveway. She was not alone. She was dragging my 8-year-old grandson by his small hand. Leo looked absolutely exhausted. He was wearing his dinosaur pajamas and dragging his feet as his mother pulled him aggressively toward my wooden porch steps. He had no idea what was happening. He did not understand the financial ruin his parents were facing or the criminal charges hanging over his mother's head. He was just a tired little boy being used as a pawn in a war he did not create. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open before she could knock. Chloe stood on my porch breathing heavily. The modest dress she wore to court was gone. She was back in her expensive designer clothes, trying desperately to project an aura of wealth she no longer possessed. She held tightly to Leo's hand, gripping his small fingers so hard the boy was wincing in physical pain. "Let the boy inside, Chloe," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It is cold out here and he needs to be asleep." Chloe glared at me, but she pushed Leo through the doorway. "Go sit in the kitchen, Leo," she commanded, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "Do not touch anything. Just sit at the table and be quiet." Leo looked up at me with sad, confused eyes. I gave him a gentle, reassuring nod. "Go on to the kitchen, little man," I said softly. "Grandpa has some apple juice in the refrigerator for you." Leo shuffled down the hallway, leaving Chloe and me alone in the dimly lit living room. She did not ask for permission to sit. She walked over to my solid oak coffee table and stood behind one of the armchairs, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked around my modest house with a familiar look of absolute disgust. She still could not reconcile the fact that a man with $50 million chose to live in a simple brick house with outdated furniture. "You played a very good game this morning, Victor," Chloe began, her voice dripping with toxic arrogance. "You humiliated me in front of that judge. You ruined my boutique. You took my cars. You really thought you won, but you made one massive miscalculation." I remained standing near the front door, watching her spin her delusional web. I did not say a single word. I let her speak because the more she spoke, the tighter she pulled the noose around her own neck. "I filed for divorce from Julian tonight," Chloe declared, a wicked, victorious smile spreading across her face. "He is a pathetic failure, and I am completely done with him. But I am not walking away empty-handed. I know exactly how the law works, Victor. I am legally married to your only son. That makes me legally entitled to a significant portion of his future assets. When you die, Julian gets that $50 million. And because of the divorce, I am going to ensure the court awards me half of his expected inheritance as a settlement." Her understanding of trust law was almost as pathetic as her understanding of basic human decency. She truly believed that future unvested inheritance was considered marital property. She thought she had discovered a brilliant legal loophole. "You are trying to claim money that does not belong to your husband," I stated simply, keeping my expression entirely blank. "It will belong to him eventually." Chloe shot back, her voice rising in pitch. "And I have the ultimate leverage to make sure I get my share right now." She pointed a sharp, manicured fingernail toward the kitchen where Leo was quietly sitting. "I am demanding full sole custody of that boy," she threatened, her eyes completely cold and feral. "I am his mother, and the court will side with me. Julian is broke and unemployed. He cannot afford to fight me. If you want to see your precious grandson ever again, you are going to pay me for the privilege. I will not wait for you to die, Victor. I want my payout today." I looked at the woman who had married my son. I looked at the monster who was actively trying to sell her own child to the highest bidder. She had reached the absolute bottom of the moral barrel, and she was extremely proud of it. "Give me a $5 million settlement right now," Chloe demanded, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. "Wire $5 million into an offshore account that I control, and I will sign over full physical and legal custody of Leo to Julian. I will pack my bags, and you will never see me again. But if you do not pay me, I am taking your grandson to Europe. I have a passport, and I know people who can help me disappear. You will die alone in this disgusting house, and Leo will completely forget you ever existed." She stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for my reaction. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to panic at the thought of losing my grandson. She expected me to reach for my checkbook and surrender a fraction of my wealth just to keep the boy safe. She thought she was holding a loaded gun to my head. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I did not betray a single ounce of emotion. I simply walked over to the heavy wooden desk in the corner of my living room. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a single piece of crisp white paper. It was a document that Sterling Pierce had faxed over to my secure home line just an hour ago. I walked back to the coffee table. I looked Chloe directly in the eyes. Her wicked smile began to falter slightly. The absolute stillness of my demeanor unnerved her. She was used to people reacting to her dramatic threats, but I was a solid brick wall. I placed the piece of paper on the oak table and slowly slid it across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of her. The rough sound of the paper scraping against the wood seemed incredibly loud in the silent room. Chloe stared down at the document. She did not reach for it immediately. Her mind was racing, trying to calculate what possible countermaneuver I could have pulled. She expected me to hand her a wire transfer confirmation or a legal settlement agreement. She thought the paper was my official surrender. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked steadily, marking the final seconds of her delusional victory. "Read the document, Chloe," I instructed, my voice carrying the absolute certainty of a judge delivering a final verdict. She slowly reached out and placed her fingers on the edge of the crisp white page. She was about to discover that her entire master plan was built on an absolute illusion. Chloe reached out and picked up the piece of paper. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edges tightly. She held it up to the warm light of the living room lamp. I watched her eyes dart across the top of the page. She was reading the official legal header. It was a certified financial affidavit and statement of net worth prepared by Sterling Pierce. The document detailed the exact financial standing of her husband, Julian Rollins. She expected to see a massive investment portfolio. She expected to see stock options, hidden offshore accounts, and an endless stream of liquid capital. She thought she was looking at a treasure map that would guarantee her $5 million payout. Instead, she saw a graveyard. Her eyes scanned down the itemized columns. Her breathing started to change. The slow, confident rhythm of her breath hitched and became shallow. She was looking at the liabilities section. She saw the massive balances on 4 different platinum credit cards. She saw the outstanding personal loans Julian had taken out to cover the exorbitant country club fees. She saw the rolling lines of credit used to purchase the expensive jewelry she demanded for her birthdays and anniversaries. She saw the devastating negative numbers attached to her own failing fashion boutique, which Julian had legally tied to his own personal credit profile to keep her vanity project afloat. She dragged her eyes to the very bottom of the page. She found the final line detailing Julian's total consolidated net worth. She read the number. Then she read it again. Her lips parted slightly in absolute confusion. "This is a joke," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "This says his net worth is negative $120,000. That is impossible. He is a bank executive. We make good money. We live in a $2 million estate." "You spent good money, Chloe," I corrected her, my voice a flat, heavy bass line in the quiet room. "You spent my money. Julian makes a modest, mid-level salary. Every single dollar he earned went toward paying the bare minimum on the massive toxic mountain of consumer debt you both accumulated. I was the one paying the mortgage on the house you do not own. I was the one paying the corporate car leases. I was the one keeping the wolves away from your door. When I ordered Sterling to cut the financial cord on Friday, I did not just stop your allowance. I exposed the absolute hollow reality of your entire marriage. Julian is mathematically and fundamentally bankrupt." Chloe lowered the paper. The color began to drain from her face. The arrogant swagger she brought into my home was rapidly dissolving into pure naked panic. Her perfect posture slumped. The designer clothes she wore suddenly looked completely ridiculous on a woman who was drowning in 6 figures of unsecured debt. But her greed was a stubborn disease. She refused to accept total defeat. She clung desperately to the one massive life raft she thought she still possessed. "That does not matter," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to regain her leverage. "I do not care about his current credit card debt. I do not care if his bank accounts are completely empty right now. He is your only son. He is your only heir. He is legally entitled to the $50 million Rollins Trust when you die. Family court judges are not stupid, Victor. They look at future vested assets. When we go to divorce court, I am going to demand a massive percentage of his guaranteed inheritance. You are still going to pay me my $5 million because you love your grandson too much to let me walk away with him." I looked at her with an expression of profound pity. She was a woman who believed she was playing a grand game of chess, but she did not even know the rules of the board. She thought she had outsmarted a man who had spent 40 years negotiating commercial contracts with ruthless corporate predators and unforgiving industry titans. She had walked into the lion's den wearing a suit made of raw meat, and she honestly thought she was the apex predator. "You really should have consulted a competent trust attorney before you filed those divorce papers tonight, Chloe," I said slowly, letting every single word sink into her desperate mind. "If you had, you would have learned a very important lesson about generational wealth." Chloe froze. She stared at me. Her hands gripped the paper so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "What trick are you trying to pull?" "I built my empire from the dirt up," I explained calmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "I worked 18-hour shifts in the freezing rain to secure my fortune. I did not accumulate $50 million by being careless with my assets. When I established the Rollins Trust 5 years ago, I sat down with Sterling Pierce and a team of the most expensive estate lawyers in the country. I explicitly instructed them to design an impenetrable legal fortress around my wealth. I wanted to ensure that my money would never fall into the hands of aggressive creditors, manipulative business partners, or greedy, opportunistic spouses." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes. I wanted her to feel the absolute crushing weight of the invisible power I held over her entire existence. "The Rollins Trust contains a very specific ironclad morality and stability clause," I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet living room. "The clause dictates the exact legal conditions under which Julian is allowed to remain a designated beneficiary. It clearly states that in the event Julian is ever involved in a formal divorce proceeding or a legal separation, his status as a beneficiary is immediately and permanently revoked." Chloe stopped breathing. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy. She stared at me in absolute horror as her brain desperately tried to process the catastrophic weight of my words. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. If Julian gets divorced, he inherits absolutely nothing. I stated, delivering the lethal blow with total precision. He is completely erased from the trust document. He gets $0. He gets zero property. He gets zero access to any corporate holdings. He is legally severed from my wealth forever. The money skips his generation entirely and is locked away in a highly secure educational and milestone fund established exclusively for Leo. Chloe shook her head frantically. Her blonde hair fell out of its pristine arrangement. "No," she gasped, taking a step backward, stumbling slightly in her expensive heels. "No, that is illegal. You cannot do that. You cannot just cut him out. He is your son. The law will not allow you to hide marital assets like that. It is perfectly legal." "Chloe," I assured her, projecting absolute unwavering certainty, "it is a standard protective measure in high net worth estate planning. The money belongs entirely to the trust entity, not to Julian. He has no claim to it if he violates the established terms. And the absolute best part of that specific clause is the activation trigger. The disinheritance is executed the exact absolute second a divorce petition is filed with the county court system." I watched the devastating realization crash over her like a tidal wave of concrete. She had just marched into my house and proudly announced that she had filed for a highly contested divorce earlier this evening. She had submitted the paperwork to the county family law division. The digital timestamp on her filing was the exact moment she executed her own demise. She thought she was executing a brilliant master plan to secure a massive payout. She thought she was trapping me in a legal corner. She thought she was using the justice system to bleed me dry. Instead, she had just pulled the trigger on her own financial execution. "You filed the divorce papers tonight, Chloe," I reminded her, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "By trying to extort me, you legally disinherited your own husband. Julian is no longer the heir to a $50 million fortune. Julian is just an unemployed man with negative $120,000 to his name. You completely destroyed the golden goose with your own two hands." Chloe dropped the certified financial affidavit. The paper fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing near the toes of her expensive designer shoes. Her entire body began to tremble. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air that felt too thick to breathe. The massive, intricate web of manipulation she had spent years spinning had completely collapsed in a matter of seconds. But her nightmare was not completely over. I had one final absolute truth to deliver. I wanted to make sure she understood the exact mathematical reality of her new life. I wanted her to know exactly what she had earned through her toxic greed. "You told me you understand how the law works." I continued, showing her absolutely no mercy. "You stood in my living room and bragged about your legal leverage. Then you must know that in this state, all marital assets and marital debts are divided equally between the two spouses during a divorce settlement. The court splits everything 50-50 right down the middle." Chloe stared at me, her eyes wide and completely vacant. Her mind was snapping under the overwhelming pressure of her complete failure. 50% of Julian's future assets is 50% of zero, I explained, slowly, speaking to her as if she were a child failing a basic math test. "You get $0 from my estate. You get $0 from Julian." "But the law goes both ways, Chloe. You are also legally responsible for 50% of the marital debt." I pointed down at the piece of paper resting on the floor. 50% of negative $120,000 is negative $60,000, I concluded. "You came to my house tonight trying to extort $5 million from a man you called a useless old fool. You threatened to steal my grandson and drag him across the ocean. And because of your own greed, your own impatience, and your own absolute arrogance, you are walking away with exactly $60,000 in crippling personal debt. You have no business. You have no cars. You have no mansion. And now you have $60,000 of toxic debt tied directly to your name." The absolute magnitude of her total destruction finally broke her. The aggressive, arrogant woman who had slapped the table at Thanksgiving dinner and demanded I be thrown into a nursing home completely ceased to exist. Her entire identity was vaporized. Her knees buckled. The strength left her legs entirely. Chloe collapsed onto the hardwood floor of my modest living room. She landed hard on her knees, the impact echoing sharply in the quiet space. She did not scream. She did not yell. She let out a long, hollow, agonizing wail that sounded like a dying animal trapped in a snare. She bowed her head, completely broken. She buried her face in her trembling hands, weeping uncontrollably into the quiet, dark reality of her new life. She had tried to play a dangerous game with a silent titan, and she had lost absolutely everything. I watched Chloe weeping on my hardwood floor. The sound of her despair did not move me in the slightest. I felt absolutely no sympathy for a woman who was willing to sell her own child for a $5 million payout. I walked past her kneeling form and went straight into the kitchen. Leo was sitting quietly at the small wooden table drinking the apple juice I had poured for him. He looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes that held so much confusion. I placed my heavy hand on his small shoulder and told him everything was going to be perfectly fine. I promised him that his grandfather was going to protect him from the storm outside. I walked back into the living room. Chloe was still sobbing into her hands. I told her to get up and get out of my house immediately. I told her she had exactly 10 seconds to leave before I called the police and had her arrested for trespassing. She scrambled to her feet and ran out the front door, leaving her own son behind without a single backward glance. She only cared about her own survival. That was all the confirmation I needed to strike the final lethal blow. I picked up my phone and called Sterling Pierce. I told him it was time to rescue my grandson. The very next morning, Sterling filed an emergency ex parte custody petition in the county family court. The legal system usually moves slowly, but when a child is in imminent danger from extortionist parents, the courts act with sudden, violent speed. I walked into the family court building wearing the same charcoal suit I had worn to the probate hearing. The air in this building felt completely different. It was not just about protecting money or assets anymore. It was about the life and future of an 8-year-old boy. Julian and Chloe were mandated by the court to appear. They sat at the respondent table looking completely destroyed by the events of the previous night. Julian stared blankly at his hands, unable to process the absolute ruin of his entire life. Chloe looked hollow and frantic. Her designer makeup was smeared and her blonde hair was a messy tangle. She had lost her boutique, her cars, and her future inheritance, but she still clung to the dangerous delusion that she could use her status as a mother to manipulate the justice system. She honestly thought family courts automatically favored the mother regardless of the circumstances. She thought the judge would let her keep Leo so she could continue to bleed Julian dry during their pending divorce proceedings. She did not realize that I had brought an absolute arsenal of digital evidence to bury her forever. Judge Ramirez presided over the emergency hearing. She was a strict, no-nonsense magistrate who had zero tolerance for parents who used their children as financial weapons. She opened the heavy file on her bench and looked down at Julian and Chloe with a sharp, critical eye. Sterling stood up and addressed the court calmly. He did not waste time with dramatic speeches or emotional appeals. He simply laid out the certified facts of the case. He informed the judge that both parents were currently under active federal and local criminal investigation for medical fraud, bribery, and elder abuse. He handed the bailiff certified financial affidavits, proving that Julian and Chloe were completely bankrupt and drowning in over $120,000 of toxic, unsecured debt. Chloe tried to object. She stood up from her chair and told the judge that she was a loving mother who was just trying to protect her son from a controlling and abusive father-in-law. She claimed she had a safe environment for him. She claimed she was the victim of extreme financial abuse and manipulation. Judge Ramirez told her to sit down and remain completely silent. The judge looked directly at Sterling and asked if there was any solid direct proof that the child was in immediate emotional or physical danger. Sterling smiled his signature cold smile and pulled a small digital audio player from his briefcase. Sterling placed the device on the podium and pressed play. The high-definition audio recording of Chloe standing in my living room the night before echoed through the quiet courtroom. The judge heard Chloe explicitly demanding a $5 million offshore wire transfer in exchange for full physical and legal custody of Leo. The judge heard her violently threaten to take the boy to Europe and disappear forever if I did not pay the ransom. The entire courtroom listened in stunned silence to a mother actively trying to sell her own flesh and blood to the highest bidder. Chloe turned absolutely pale. She sank down into her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. The confident, arrogant mother routine was completely shattered, but Sterling was not finished dismantling her life. He approached the bench and handed the judge the thick black folder prepared by my elite private intelligence team. He explained in slow, deliberate detail that Chloe had spent the last 12 months secretly embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from Julian's corporate retirement accounts. He provided the international routing numbers and the offshore banking details confirming the hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was actively planning to abandon her husband and flee the jurisdiction long before their financial ruin became public knowledge. Julian turned his head and looked at Chloe with a mixture of profound shock and pure concentrated hatred. He finally understood the absolute depth of her betrayal. She had been stealing from him while constantly berating him for not providing enough luxury. She had been planning to leave him destitute while he defended her against his own family. He realized he had destroyed his relationship with his father for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a temporary bank account. Judge Ramirez closed the heavy black folder. Her expression was completely cold and utterly unforgiving. She looked down at Chloe and Julian with absolute disgust radiating from her eyes. She stated for the official court record that in her entire judicial career she had never seen such a blatant, disturbing, and sociopathic attempt to monetize a child. She declared that neither parent was fit to care for a houseplant, let alone a vulnerable 8-year-old boy. The judge picked up her wooden gavel and slammed it down with a loud, definitive crack. She issued her ruling immediately. She stripped Julian and Chloe of all physical and legal custody effective right this second. She granted me full, temporary primary custody of Leo with permanent guardianship proceedings scheduled for the following month. She issued a strict restraining order, preventing Chloe from coming within 500 feet of my grandson or my personal residence. Furthermore, the judge noted that, since the massive suburban mansion belonged entirely to the Rollins Trust, Chloe had absolutely no legal right of residency or marital claim to the property. The judge ordered county law enforcement to escort Chloe to the estate to collect her basic personal belongings and then permanently remove her from the premises. That afternoon, I sat in the back of my dark sport utility vehicle parked discreetly across the street from the massive suburban estate. I watched the final chapter of Chloe's false reality come to a complete and devastating end. 2 county sheriff deputies stood on the large concrete driveway watching carefully as Chloe walked out the heavy oak front doors for the very last time. She was crying hysterically, her face red and swollen. She did not have her luxury white sport utility vehicle to drive away in. She did not have her expensive custom furniture. She was carrying a single medium-sized black suitcase filled with whatever basic clothing and toiletries the armed deputies had allowed her to pack during her 15-minute window. She walked slowly down the long driveway, her expensive heels clicking weakly against the pavement. Several of her wealthy neighbors had stepped out onto their manicured lawns to watch the spectacle unfold. The same people she had desperately tried to impress were now whispering and pointing at her absolute disgrace. She looked back at the massive $2 million house she used to rule like a tyrant. She had lost everything because she could not control her own toxic greed. She had tried to steal a fortune and wound up with nothing but a single suitcase and $60,000 of debt. I watched her drag her rolling suitcase down the quiet suburban street, completely alone and utterly ruined. I felt no joy in her destruction, but I felt a profound sense of absolute justice. I tapped the dark tinted window glass and told my driver to take me home. I had an 8-year-old boy waiting for me in my safe, warm brick house, and I needed to make sure he knew he was finally secure. The storm was over and the predators had been completely removed from our lives. The rain came down in heavy, freezing sheets that Thursday night. It was the kind of bitter, unforgiving storm that stripped the last remaining dead leaves from the old oak trees and turned the suburban asphalt into running rivers of dark, cold water. I sat in my worn leather recliner listening to the fierce wind howl against the thick window panes of my old brick house. The heavy brick walls of my home had withstood decades of severe weather. They were built on a solid foundation, just like the life I had meticulously constructed for myself. Inside the living room, the air was warm and deeply quiet. The fireplace crackled softly, pushing the bitter cold away from the hardwood floors. For the first time in 3 years, my house felt like a true sanctuary. The toxic, arrogant energy that Julian and Chloe used to bring into this sacred space was completely gone. I was finally at peace. Then I heard the knocking. It was not a confident, sharp knock. It was a weak, frantic pounding against the heavy oak front door. It sounded exactly like a man who was drowning and desperately slapping his bare hands against the side of a wooden rescue boat. I did not need to look through the front window to know exactly who was standing on my porch. My private security team had already alerted me that Julian had been formally evicted from the corporate mansion earlier that afternoon. The county sheriffs had physically escorted him off the premises after the property management firm officially seized the estate. He had absolutely nowhere else to go. I stood up from my recliner and walked slowly down the hallway. I reached out and unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt, pulling the door open. The freezing wind immediately whipped through the entryway, carrying the harsh smell of wet concrete and decaying autumn leaves. Julian stood under the small overhang of my front porch. He was an absolute picture of total catastrophic devastation. The 42-year-old bank executive who used to sneer at my cheap work boots was completely unrecognizable. He was soaking wet. The freezing rain plastered his thinning hair flat against his skull. He was wearing a thin designer suit jacket that offered absolutely no protection against the bitter cold. The expensive Italian fabric was completely ruined, clinging to his shivering frame like a wet trash bag. His custom leather shoes were covered in thick, dark mud. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering uncontrollably in the freezing night air. He held a single damp cardboard box in his arms. It contained whatever meager personal belongings the armed deputies had allowed him to hastily gather from the multi-million-dollar estate he falsely believed he owned. He was a man who had completely reached the absolute end of his arrogant delusion. He was entirely broke. He had no wife. Chloe had abandoned him the moment the money vanished, running off to deal with her own massive criminal nightmare after the family court judge threw her out on the street. He had no child. The judge had explicitly deemed him an unfit parent and legally stripped away his custody rights, placing my grandson securely in my care. He had no job. The bank had fired him the exact moment the federal fraud investigation became public knowledge. His elite country club friends had completely abandoned him. He was totally alone, facing a crushing, suffocating mountain of $120,000 in toxic, unsecured debt. "Dad," Julian gasped, his voice cracking pathetically over the loud sound of the pouring rain. "Dad, please let me inside. I am freezing to death out here. I have been walking for hours in the dark. My credit cards are completely locked. My bank accounts are frozen by the federal investigators. My phone is dead. I have absolutely nothing left in the entire world." I stood perfectly still in the warm, bright doorway, looking down at him. I did not step aside. I did not open the thin mesh screen door to let him pass. I simply stared at the man who had sat at a Thanksgiving dinner table and silently nodded while his greedy wife demanded I be thrown into a state-funded nursing home. "Please," Julian sobbed, dropping the wet cardboard box onto the wooden porch planks. The box hit the ground with a dull, heavy thud, spilling a few soaked silk neckties and a shattered framed corporate photograph onto the wet wood. "You have to let me come home. I just need a warm place to stay. Let me move back into my old childhood bedroom. I will not be any trouble at all. I will stay completely out of your way. I just need a roof over my head while I figure out how to fix this massive disaster." He reached out his trembling, pale hand, attempting to grab the brass handle of the screen door. I did not move a single muscle, but my gaze was so incredibly cold and sharp that he immediately pulled his hand back. He shrank physically under the absolute crushing weight of my unforgiving silence. "It was all Chloe," he cried desperately, trying to shift the blame to the woman he had chosen to marry. "She manipulated everything, Dad. She was the one who wanted your money. She was the one who complained about your boots on the rug. She was the one who hired that corrupt doctor to write the fake medical report. She forced me to go along with it. She told me she would divorce me and take everything if I did not support her plans. You know how she is. You know how toxic and demanding she can be. I was just trying to keep my marriage together. I was just trying to survive her crazy financial demands. You have to believe me. I am your son. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood out in the freezing rain to die." I listened to his pathetic, cowardly excuses. He was 42 years old, and he was still desperately blaming other people for his own miserable, catastrophic failures. He refused to accept that his absolute cowardice was the very weapon Chloe used to destroy him. He wanted to play the helpless victim. He wanted me to look at him as a naive child who simply made a small mistake. But he was not a naive child. He was a fully grown adult man who explicitly chose to stand by while predators actively conspired to strip away his father's fundamental human rights. I thought about the brutal decades I spent breaking my back on industrial loading docks. I thought about hauling heavy freight across the country in the dead of winter, missing sleep and sacrificing my own physical health so he could live a life of absolute unearned privilege. I thought about the racist commercial bankers who denied my first business loans in the 1980s and the sheer violent willpower it took to build a $50 million logistics empire from absolute scratch. I looked at Julian, and I saw a man who inherited the glorious prize but possessed absolutely none of the resilient strength required to keep it. He had squandered every single advantage I had ever given him. I looked at Julian with an expression of pure, absolute ice. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt no paternal warmth. I felt nothing but the profound clinical detachment of a successful businessman surveying a completely failed toxic investment. "This house has no room for cowards who sell out their own blood," I said. My voice was a low, steady thunder that cut completely through the chaotic noise of the heavy rain. Julian froze. His pathetic shivering and sobbing stopped instantly. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the deep, bottomless well of paternal forgiveness he had relied on his entire life had completely dried up forever. "You sat at a dining table and agreed that I was totally useless." I continued delivering the final, unyielding verdict with absolute surgical precision. "You stood in my living room and watched your wife hand a $50,000 bribe to a corrupt doctor to have me legally declared insane and locked in a cage. You did not utter a single solitary word in my defense. You explicitly chose your designer suits and your luxury European cars over the man who gave you everything you ever had. You wanted me entirely out of your life, Julian. You got exactly what you wanted." "Dad, please do not do this," he begged, falling heavily to his knees on the wet, slick wooden porch. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." I looked down at his weeping, broken form one last time. "If you want to eat, grab a hammer and find a job," I stated flatly. I stepped back into the warm, illuminated hallway. I grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut directly in his face. The sound was incredibly loud and absolutely final. I reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking it with a sharp metallic click. I stood in the hallway for a brief second, listening to the muffled, pathetic sound of my son wailing and scratching against the thick, solid wood. His cries meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. The freezing storm outside was entirely his own creation, and he would have to survive the bitter elements completely on his own. I turned my back on the front door and walked slowly down the hallway toward the back of the house. The sound of the freezing rain and the pathetic sobbing completely faded away. It was replaced by the comforting warm crackle of the living room fireplace and the soft bright light glowing from the kitchen archway. I walked into the warm, cozy kitchen. The air smelled beautiful. It smelled of rich cinnamon ground nutmeg and baked brown sugar. My 8-year-old grandson Leo was sitting at the sturdy wooden dining table. He was wearing his warm, thick flannel pajamas. He had his school books spread out across the table, happily working on his second-grade math homework. He chewed thoughtfully on the yellow end of his pencil, kicking his feet gently under the wooden chair, completely safe and entirely oblivious to the dark, miserable reality of the parents who had abandoned him for their own greed. I smiled a genuine warm smile. The heavy tension in my chest completely dissolved. I walked over to the kitchen counter. I picked up a small ceramic plate holding a large warm slice of homemade sweet potato pie. I carried it over to the table and set it down gently right next to his open math notebook. Leo looked up, his bright eyes shining with pure, innocent joy. "Thank you, Grandpa Vic," he said, picking up his silver fork with a wide, happy smile. "You are very welcome, little man," I replied, resting my heavy, calloused hand on his small shoulder. "Take your time with the math. Grandpa is right here." I pulled out the wooden chair across from him and sat down. I watched him eat the sweet pie and focus intently on his numbers. The brick house was completely secure. The greedy predators had been entirely locked out in the cold, dark night. The $50 million legacy I had bled to build was finally safe, resting securely in the hands of a young boy who would be raised to understand the true, absolute value of hard work, unwavering loyalty, and unbreakable integrity. 1 year later, the heavy scent of cheap fried grease and stale coffee clung to Chloe like a second skin. It was Tuesday afternoon at a run-down diner on the edge of the city limits. She stood behind the scratched laminate counter wearing a stiff polyester uniform that was stained with ketchup and bleach. Her expensive designer heels had been permanently replaced by heavy, slip-resistant orthopedic shoes. Her feet ached constantly with a dull, throbbing pain that never went away. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot, completely stripped of its expensive salon treatments and chemical gloss. She was working her second consecutive double shift of the week. A truck driver sitting at the corner booth snapped his fingers, demanding more coffee. A year ago, Chloe would have fired a store manager for looking at her the wrong way. Now she simply picked up the heavy glass pot and shuffled over to pour the dark liquid into his stained mug, forcing a polite and submissive smile. She was exhausted physically and entirely broken psychologically. The family court judge had not only stripped her of her child, but had also finalized a devastating divorce settlement. Because she had actively filed for the divorce to try and steal my money, she inherited 50% of Julian's massive unsecured credit card debt. Her meager wages at the diner were heavily garnished by aggressive collection agencies. Every time she earned a small cash tip, she knew a significant portion of it belonged to the lawyers and the banks she had once tried to manipulate. She lived in a tiny rented room in a dangerous neighborhood. She had to take 2 separate public buses just to get to her miserable job because she could not afford a car. She had no friends left. The wealthy country club wives had blocked her phone number the exact moment her bankruptcy and criminal fraud investigation became public knowledge. She spent her lonely nights staring at the peeling paint on her ceiling, remembering the $2 million mansion she threw away because she was too greedy to simply be grateful for what she had. Across town, Julian was living his own personalized version of absolute hell. He was no longer a senior bank executive sitting behind a polished mahogany desk. He was a 43-year-old entry-level retail associate at a discount electronics store in a dying shopping mall. He wore a cheap blue polo shirt with a plastic name tag pinned to his chest. He spent his days standing under harsh fluorescent lights trying to sell extended warranties to angry customers who openly disrespected him. His soft, manicured hands were now dry and calloused from unloading heavy cardboard boxes in the dusty stockroom. He lived in a cramped, miserable studio apartment located directly next to a noisy, elevated train line. The constant rattling of the train cars shook his thin windows every 15 minutes, making it impossible to sleep soundly. He had absolutely nothing left of his former glamorous life. His designer suits had been sold to a consignment shop to pay for his basic groceries. His expensive watches were gone. Every night he sat on a cheap mattress on the floor, eating instant noodles and thinking about the rainy night he stood on my porch. He remembered the heavy sound of my deadbolt locking him out in the cold. He finally understood that his massive ego was nothing but a fragile glass house built entirely on the solid concrete foundation of my hard work. He had traded a $50 million legacy for the temporary approval of a toxic gold digger who abandoned him the second the money vanished. He was completely alone, trapped in a prison of his own cowardice, forced to bow his head to retail managers who were half his age. Far away from the noise and the misery of the city, I sat in a small aluminum fishing boat, gently rocking on the calm surface of a beautiful crystal-clear lake. The early morning sun reflected off the water, creating a brilliant golden glow that warmed my face and my hands. The air smelled of fresh pine trees and clean, deep water. I was wearing my old, comfortable flannel shirt and my battered work boots. Sitting right next to me, holding a small fiberglass fishing rod, was my 9-year-old grandson, Leo. He wore a bright orange life jacket and a wide, happy smile. He was growing taller and stronger every single day. He was doing exceptionally well in school, and his teachers constantly praised his kindness and his respectful attitude toward others. He had completely forgotten the toxic screaming and the chaotic stress of his former life with his parents. He was safe. He was deeply loved. He was exactly where he belonged. I watched him cast his fishing line out into the deep blue water with a practiced flick of his wrist. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settle into my bones. The $50 million fortune that had caused so much destruction was no longer sitting in a simple liquid account. Sterling Pierce and I had completely restructured the entire Rollins Trust. The money was now locked inside an ironclad educational and milestone trust fund designed exclusively for Leo. But I did not want my grandson to grow up entitled. I did not want him to become a weak, arrogant man like his father. The trust contained very specific, unalterable conditions. Leo would not receive a single dollar simply for turning 18. In order to access the generational wealth, he first had to graduate from an accredited university with a useful degree. Then he was legally required to work a physically demanding blue-collar job for 2 full consecutive years. He needed to learn what it meant to wake up before the sun, to sweat for a paycheck, and to earn the respect of his peers through hard, honest labor. He had to prove his character before he could touch the empire. I took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. My silence during all those months of disrespect from Julian and Chloe was never a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate test of character. I had given them enough rope to hang themselves, and they had eagerly built their own gallows. They failed the test, and they paid the ultimate price. The weak branches of the family tree had been pruned away completely, allowing the roots to finally grow strong and healthy once again. Respect is never freely given, it must be earned. Assuming the worth of someone based on their silence, their worn-out shoes, or their modest lifestyle is the fastest way to orchestrate your own ruin. Wealth is not defined by the luxury cars you drive or the designer labels you wear to impress strangers. It is defined by the quiet power you hold and the unbreakable boundaries you enforce. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, integrity, and gratitude are what make you family. When arrogance and greed blind you to the sacrifices of the people who built your foundation, you do not just lose an inheritance, you lose your dignity. True power whispers, it never has to shout. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.